You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another compilation of older content. I thought I'd put together my entire first season of Media Opinions. Now, Media Opinions is a pretty self-explanatory series as to what it's about. However, it did start 7 years ago, then episode 2 was 5 years ago, and then they were sporadic throughout then, but the last episode of what I'm going to call Season 1 just came out a few days ago. The only reason I'm calling it a season is because it goes with my standard 15-episode season. Now, obviously, with all of my series, that's not necessarily going to be the case, but you will see some pretty drastic shift in quality, given how old of a series this is and how late it ran, and how there's, like I said, quite a few gaps between the episodes. But let's just jump into it.
I do apologize, I am just getting better from being sick, which is why there hasn't been a video in a few days up until now, and my voice is just barely coming off that. So I may sound a little bit off, but hopefully by the time I upload the next video, I should sound completely normal. Regardless, today we're going to be talking about localization. If you're unfamiliar with the term localization, it's when a form of media, be it a movie, a TV show, whatever it is, gets taken to a different country, it has changes done to it. Now, sometimes those changes are as simple as translating it from its native language into the language of the country it's going to. Other times it involves censorship, and other times it involves completely changing the work to be something completely different from what it originally was. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the good and bad kinds of localization, because I think there are both. I'm going to be using Japanese media as examples, because those are typically the easiest, although this does hold true to other forms of media as well. Let's start off with a shitty example. Censorship. Dead Man Wonderland is brutally censored, to the point that I can't even find the uncensored version online anywhere, not with a Japanese import, nowhere. Which, to be fair, I don't know that the Japanese version is uncensored, but I know that it is at least less censored, or that at least an uncensored version exists, because I've seen an uncensored version of the intro. Dead Man Wonderland is one of the most censored animes I've ever seen. Ironically, the dub is uncensored on the US release, but the original Japanese language dub is not. I think that's a bad thing to happen. I'll give another shitty example. South Park: The Stick of Truth, when it was released in Europe and Australia, got kinda butchered when it came to specific levels. They cut it out and just replaced it with a title card telling you what happened. And while I do think the title card was kind of funny with the way they described it, it's bullshit that European players and Australian players couldn't get the full experience on console. Granted, in the US we didn't have to worry about that, but still, it's a shitty thing to do. There are countless other examples of censorship, but I think you get the idea. Now let's talk about something good. Turning something into something completely different. This can usually go one of two ways. It'll turn out to be utter shit, or it'll turn out to be fucking amazing. And what I mean by that is, I'll use MXC, for example. MXC, if you don't know, is the American release of the TV series Takeshi's Castle. Takeshi's Castle is an obstacle course TV series where contestants compete in different various obstacle courses. That's pretty much all it is in the original Japanese. They do have this overarching set of cutaways with Count Takeshi and his little sidekick, but overall, there's not much else to the show. It's still entertaining as all hell, don't get me wrong. The obstacle courses are crazy, the weird outfits they wear, things like that. But when they brought it over to the US, they made what is, in my opinion, one of the best shows ever on TV, MXC. With MXC, they completely redubbed the show, rearranged the segments, and basically made new episodes out of existing footage. And when they did that, they also completely rewrote all the dialogue, making it much, much more comedic. Instead of Takeshi and his assistant, they call themselves Vic Romano and Kenny Blankenship. And while it's still fun to go back and watch the original Takeshi's Castle, I find MXC so much more entertaining. They also did similar things with Shin-Chan and Ghost Stories, two different animes that, although Shin-Chan was still pretty comedic with the Japanese dub, was much more comedic and dirty with the American dub. And with Ghost Stories, they turned it from a horror into a comedy. There are other examples of things changing into other things, such as the Godzilla films. The first 3 Godzilla movies, when they came out in the US, were recut with American footage. I have only seen the American version of King Kong vs. Godzilla. I have not seen the American version of the first Godzilla or the second Godzilla yet. But to be fair, I haven't watched those two at all yet. I'm still working on it. I do have quite a lot of Godzilla movies in my collection that I need to get around to watching. Or with Gamera, they did the same thing with the very first Gamera movie. So yeah, you get the idea with that. But localization is something that we're seeing increasingly less and less. Most of the times we'll get subtitles, which is what I prefer anyway when watching anime, most of the time anyway, as well as foreign films. But there are some instances where I prefer the dub, such as Dragon Ball. I refuse to watch Dragon Ball in Japanese because I hate Goku's voice. I also prefer the Bruce Falconer soundtrack, but that's a different topic for a different day. So when you get to localization, things are changing. We don't get a lot of this crazy shit like we used to, and it's kind of sad. I miss the crazy over-the-top changes like MXC, Shin-Chan, and Godzilla. Things like, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon got butchered with their 4Kids releases. 4Kids destroys things when they localize them. So localizing can be kind of a double-edged sword, but I do like localization when it's done right, and I think it can make something that much more entertaining. It's still nice to have the original, and if you can include both on a DVD release, that's great. I know that Shin-Chan and Ghost Stories both contain the Japanese dub for the episodes included, and I do also know that I believe each season of MXC contains at least one episode of Takeshi's Castle. I only own season 1, so I can only speak for that, but still. And of course with localization, you sometimes get anomalies like the Speedy dub, which I've talked about at length before. But I'll go more into dubs versus subs at some other point, with another episode of Media Opinions.
And today we'll be talking about reality TV. Now, reality TV, most of the time, I would say, is complete and total trash. Now, sometimes that trash can be entertaining. Other times, it's just disgusting and makes me think that humanity was a mistake. But that being said, there's a certain type of reality TV that I actually very much enjoy. There's certain types that I do enjoy, plural, to be specific. My number one favorite type of reality TV shows is pretty much anything with Gordon Ramsay in it. Kitchen Nightmares, Hell's Kitchen, Hotel Hell, that kind of stuff. I enjoy because Gordon Ramsay is just such an entertaining guy. Not to mention, it's interesting to see him try to save these businesses, although 9 times out of 10 he fails, but not because of his own ineptitude, but because it was either too little too late, or they don't actually listen to him. And a lot of the times it is kind of rolling the dice, you know? But, nevertheless, the shows themselves are still incredibly entertaining. That being said, other than Gordon Ramsay, another one I enjoy a lot is Dog the Bounty Hunter. I used to watch Dog the Bounty Hunter every day when I got home from the paper route, because that's all that was on back then. Because I'd get home around 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd watch Dog the Bounty Hunter, and I loved it a lot. It was interesting to see because, you know, it was a look into bounty hunting, which is a part of the criminal justice system you don't see a lot of, as far as, like, publicized anyway. So it was interesting to see that, and I still enjoy that show very much to this day. I've recently purchased quite a few of the DVDs. Unfortunately, there is, like, no full series release or even full season releases, because, for whatever reason, A&E in their infinite wisdom thought it wise to do best of DVD sets, which is one thing that drives me absolutely insane. Best of sets, not my favorite thing. We'll get into that maybe in another episode later on. That being said, I do enjoy Dog the Bounty Hunter a lot. Other ones I enjoy are things like Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. I used to watch it all the time back in the day when I was really getting into conspiracy theories. Of course, being older and wiser, I don't necessarily think that all of the things in that show are true. In fact, a lot of it, they're quote-unquote experts, or just people they find who self-proclaim themselves as experts who don't know what the hell they're talking about. The thing is that's what makes it entertaining, because everything in Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura feels so staged, and that's why I love it. The beginning of the show, they always, and I do mean always, set up a dichotomy between the characters, right? And when I say characters, they're portraying themselves, but they're basically playing a character. So it depends. It switches back and forth between who believes it and who doesn't, but usually they'll present a conspiracy theory at the beginning of the show. Half of the people will believe it, and half of the people will say, no, that's bullshit, I'm going to disprove it. And they split off in that way, and then at the end, they kind of come together, and they're like, basically, they're like, oh, without saying anything conclusive, they're always like, you know, this could be true. And I think that's part of what I really like about it, is it's so predictable and formulaic in that sense. In addition to that, Jesse Ventura himself has a ton of personality. I mean, he was a pro wrestler, so of course he's going to have a ton of personality. But other than that, another thing that I really like about the staged nature of the show is there's all this cheesy shit that they added in to try and make it seem more epic than it actually was. Like, there's this one episode, I think it's the Area 51 episode, where this trucker pulls up, and he looks around to make sure there's nobody watching him, but there's a camera, like, right there, and it's like, there's no way in hell he missed that, and he's clearly doing that for the camera. It's really fucking dumb, and that's what makes it funny. And, again, I'm an open-minded guy, too. I'm not saying that there isn't shady shit that goes on. I just think that show exaggerates the fuck out of everything, and that's part of why I like it. I think probably the best example was White Rabbit in the Ozarks episode. It's this one guy who's trying to act super badass, and he's like, yeah, I know what's going on here, yeah. But then they're like, they've been filming him this whole time, right? But his face has been blurred out. But then he's like running around trying to do all these sick parkour moves, and he knocks the camera down. He's like, I don't like to be filmed, even though he's been being filmed for like the last 20 minutes. It's really fucking stupid, and again, you gotta see it to understand why I enjoy it so much, but it's good television, and that's what I like about it. I also like things like Jackass, where they would just, hurt themselves for views, basically. Or Viva La Bam, even though that's even more staged than Conspiracy Theory. Like, Viva La Bam is probably the most staged reality TV show I've ever seen. I'd say it's actually more of a sitcom than a reality show in some aspects. But I'd highly recommend watching that kind of stuff, too. I could go on and on about the good ones. I also like things like Scare Tactics with Tracy Morgan. I haven't seen the original Scare Tactics before he took over. I watched Fear Factor a lot back in the day. I've seen my share, right? But then you take all that good, enjoyable, entertaining reality TV, and then you just got the utter garbage on the other side of the spectrum. You got shit like The Jersey Shore, where it's just a bunch of unlikable pricks being unlikable pricks. And then you got, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or Kendra, Life in the Fab Lane, or whatever other ones there are that are just like, let's follow celebrities around in their quote-unquote daily life, and they can just be annoying rich celebrities that nobody cares about. At least I don't care about. I mean, maybe there's some people out there who genuinely like those shows, but that kind of shit bored the hell out of me. But my point is, reality TV is very much a mixed bag, and I think like when it's, let's focus on celebrities and shit like that, I couldn't care less. There is, however, one exception to that, which I do enjoy, and again, it's mostly ironically. That'd be Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan's Hogan Knows Best, where it was Hulk Hogan living his daily life. But that's mainly just because I really like Hulk Hogan. I didn't care for the spin-off of, like, Brooke Knows Best. That was kind of dumb. Since this video is about reality TV, and since I did mention Dog the Bounty Hunter earlier, I'd just like to take this opportunity to offer my condolences to Dwayne Dog Chapman, Dog the Bounty Hunter himself, because his wife Beth did actually pass away not that long ago. Her cancer did finally get the best of her, and I do want to offer my condolences for as little as that means and say, rest in peace, and I hope you're able to go on, dog. It's sad that it happened, and I hope you make a good recovery from it. I hope that your family's able to overcome. She's in a better place. I know Dog himself is a religious guy, so hopefully that's some sort of comfort he has there. At the very least, she's no longer suffering with her cancer. And it's been a really long time since I've done one of these. In fact, I think I've done one a year since I started this series, so isn't that something? This episode's going to tie into the first episode. The first episode I talked about localization, but I didn't really touch on the whole dubs versus subs argument very much. So with that, we'll be talking about dubs versus subs. If you're unfamiliar with the term, in the anime world, a dub is what is, the voiceover work of the series. Typically the dub, when used in this context, is referring to the English dub or otherwise translated dub. However, the Japanese audio track is still a dub. That's actually a common misconception that I've run into with people who don't understand that. They say, no, the Japanese isn't a dub, it's the original. No, it's still dubbed, because the cartoon characters are not real. You're not picking up their audio that way. You're dubbing it over the animation. That's how a dub works. But in the context of the dubs versus subs argument, I'm specifically referring to the English translation dub. Now, a lot of people are adamant about which they prefer, dub or sub, and I typically am too, to be fair. However, I don't think there's necessarily one right answer. For me, it does sometimes depend on the series. I do definitely lean in favor of one, and I'll get to that in a minute, what my preference tends to be. However, there are times when the other does actually suit it better. And I'm going to tell you, if you tend to prefer one way or the other, doesn't make you wrong regardless, because I definitely think there are benefits and negatives to both. And I'm not going to be gatekeepy and tell you that my way is the right way, because that's just an asshole thing to do. Alright, now down to what my preference is to get you guys going. I am a sub guy. Absolutely I am. I prefer the English subtitles with the original Japanese audio track almost every time. Again, there are some exceptions. For instance, Dragon Ball, I almost exclusively watch dubbed because I don't like several of the Japanese voice actors. Like Goku and such. I don't think that voice actress fits for that character, especially since Goku is voiced by the same character as a kid and an adult in Japanese, as well as Goku's kids are all voiced by the same actress as well as Goku Jr. and Bardock, and it's just ridiculous in the Japanese how it's all the same lady. And don't get me wrong, I think she does a fine job in other things. I think she did a fine job, for instance, in Dororana Enmakun, the original, but I just don't get why she voices Goku, especially, you know, as an adult and all that. And I get they wanted her to sound more, you know, innocent and stuff like that, but I don't know, it just doesn't work for me, and there's a few other voices I don't like in the Japanese. Not to mention with Dragon Ball, I prefer the Falconer soundtrack for Z over the, you know, original soundtrack. In addition to Dragon Ball, I do also tend to prefer Black Butler dubbed. The main reason for that is because it takes place in Victorian London, and it makes more sense in English. That's not always, you know, a deal breaker. But it definitely does help on this one. For instance, JoJo, I will never watch dubbed, even though, you know, Part 1 takes place in Victorian London. The dub for Part 1 is particularly bad. And I don't like the dub for Black Lagoon, because I don't like Revi's voice in the dub. Revi's my favorite character in the series, too, so that's kind of a big deal. Other things I tend to prefer dubbed are comedy series, like Shin-Chan, I think is typically funnier dubbed. Although I will say that the sub is still funny. They do include one episode with the original Japanese audio track and subtitles on the Shin-Chan Season 1 Part 1 DVD, and I still got a laugh out of that episode. So I'm not saying that Shin-Chan is bad, you know, subbed, I just think it's better dubbed. Or Boba Bobo Bobobo, I think that's better dubbed too. Then there's a couple of series that I can watch either way, and granted, I can watch most of the ones I watch dubbed sub too. Like Black Butler, I like the sub as well as the dub. Especially since in the Japanese, Sebastian is voiced by Daisuke Ono, who's the guy who played Jotaro in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So, you know, there's definitely a plus side to that. And, of course, there's things that weren't originally comedy that became comedy with the dub, like Ghost Stories. I don't think I could ever watch Ghost Stories subbed because it'd probably be really boring, but the dub makes it really fun and wacky and over the top. But another series I can watch both subbed and dubbed, which is probably the prime example of it, is Death Note. I prefer the Japanese in Death Note, but the dub is really fucking good. I forgot how good the dub was. I've been rewatching it, and the dub for Death Note is really good. Like, Mikami's voice in the dub is fucking great. I forgot how good he sounded. There are also so bad it's good dubs that I really enjoy because of how stupid and cheesy they are. Pretty much anything by Manga Entertainment. You know, the Devilman dub with gems like this.
Oh, of course, it's my old friend Rio. How the hell have you been keeping then?
And this.
Why God? Why God? Why God?
Stuff like that. Or the Violence Jack dub with things like this.
God damn it! Where the hell is Jack? Fucking chicken shit! Fucking shit! Fucking shit! Holy shit, the bastard's here!
Or, you know, my often used outro from Yorotsuki Doji, you know, one little sniff of pussy and you lose it. Manga Entertainment did really stupid, over-the-top, cheesy dubs that are really fun to look back on. So, what are some valid reasons for both subs and dubs? Well, for the subs, you're going to be a lot more accurate to the original intent of the series. And there's going to be, you know, much more faithful dialogue. Albeit the subtitles can't 100% accurately translate because some things just don't make sense when translated directly. But they're a much closer bet than the dubs. Don't get me wrong, the dubs can be fun with their changes and their Americanizations for sure, with things like Shin-Chan and Ghost Stories, as I previously mentioned. But a lot of the changes can just be bad. Like, there was that line from To Love Ru, where they, like, injected politics into it, where they changed a line from saying it's old-fashioned to it's misogynistic. And that's another problem I run into with a lot of these companies that do the subs and dubs. You know, like, for instance, I no longer support Funimation. And I'll still buy stuff from other ones, you know, like Sentai and Viz, even though they also have their problems that I have. Like, To Love Ru thing was Sentai, however, it was like an isolated incident as far as I know, and if it wasn't, then whatever, I don't buy a lot of their stuff. I do buy some of their stuff still, like, they haven't pissed me off in the exact, like, level that Funimation has, but, you know, that's a whole other topic. If you guys have been watching me for a while, you know why I don't like Funimation. There was the Vic Mignogna stuff, there was the way they talk to fans and the way they treat fans, and the way that they inject things into their dubs and stuff now, and the way that they were with, you know, interspecies reviewers, which doesn't look like my cup of tea anyway, but still. Funimation did used to be cool. You know, Shin-Chan was Funimation. And Ghost Stories wasn't Funimation, but it had Monica Rial in it, and she was one of the better characters, so I'll give her credit where credit's due. I don't like her as a person. In fact, I very much dislike her as a person. I think she's a terrible person. And I think that her work as Bulma was subpar at best. But I did like her in Ghost Stories, and I think she's alright in Shin-Chan. But one of the things that's, easier about dubs is you don't have to read really anything. I mean, there might be certain things that you have to read, like signs that say, 2 days later or something. But some people don't want to read. They just want to sit down and watch it. And I get that. That's why I'm okay with dubs as an option. But another problem you might run into with dubs are things like copyright issues. Specifically with things like JoJo. Now granted, the subtitles technically run into the same problem, but since you have the original Japanese audio track, you can still hear what it's supposed to be. For instance, let's take Part 4, for example. There's countless examples of this throughout the entire series, but let's take Killer Queen, for instance. In the dub, he'll say Deadly Queen instead of Killer Queen. In the subtitles themselves will say Deadly Queen, but you'll still hear the Japanese with him going, Killer Queen! Bites the dust, though! Which, I'm surprised Bites the Dust was allowed, but Killer Queen wasn't. I mean, weird what is and isn't allowed, but okay. Other good things to come from dubs is sometimes they up the soundtrack, like the Bruce Falconer soundtrack from Dragon Ball Z, like I mentioned before. There's also the, metal soundtrack from Cyber City 080808. Although with that one, that is out of print, or that didn't get a home release, or something like that. It's like, the DVD has the Japanese soundtrack, which isn't as good from what I understand. Another plus side with dubs is with things like comedy series, sometimes they do jokes that are more relatable and understandable to a US audience, or the audience they're going for. On the negative side, though, a lot of things you can run into with dubs is censorship. Take 4Kids, for example. Their dubs censored the hell out of anything they got their hands on. And that wasn't just dubs, mind you, that was just localization in general. But the dubs were definitely a part of that. Another example of censorship, albeit kind of a funny one, it's not an English dub, but the French dub of Fist of the North Star drastically changed the story to make it less violent, and they had it so that Kenshiro was tickling people to death. It was really stupid, but it was funny. But yeah, in this argument of subs versus dubs, I definitely am 99% on the side of subs. There are occasional series where I prefer the dub, but for the most part the sub is my go-to thing. In fact, there's many series that don't even get dubs. And that's something Discotech often runs into, is they don't dub series, they just provide their own subtitles. But overall, I think subs are better. So yeah, it's another episode of Media Opinions, and today I'll be talking about romance, and later on tragedy. There will be some overlap. Many viewers have probably noticed that I'm usually not a big fan of romance when it comes to fiction. That's not to say that I don't like romance, it's just it's usually not my cup of tea. And it's usually not what I go out of my way for. There are certain romances that I do enjoy. Obviously, my favorite movie is Fireworks, which, is a romance, but it's got other elements to it. It's got action, tragedy, and other things to it. But, I'm not really into a lot of romance that's just traditional romance. There are other things that are unconventional romance that I'm certainly into, like Future Diary. To an extent, Elfen Lied is a romance. Even Devilman has romance in it. There's Akira wanting to be with Miki. There's Akira getting with Miki in Devilman Saga. So it's I'm not completely opposed to romance, but it's certainly not what I go out of my way for. But there is a certain type of romance that I do almost always like, and that is tragic romance. I think that's partially because I'm a big sucker for tragedy, which we'll get into more in a minute. Usually when romance has a tragic payoff, I usually tend to get more into it. For instance, spoilers ahead for Clannad After Story. But, I love Clannad and Clannad After Story. Very dramatic and sad show. Especially, Nagisa dies after giving birth to Ushio, and then Tomoya misses out on the first few years of Ushio's life, only to reconnect with her and then have Ushio die. The tragedy in that makes Clannad easily my favorite, traditional slice-of-life anime. I'm not usually into slice-of-life either, but there are certainly some that I do like. Clannad is one of them that I'm really into. Shin-Chan is obviously one I've been getting into. If you've noticed, I bought a lot of Shin-Chan stuff recently. JoJo Part 4 has a lot of slice-of-life elements to it. Apparently Mushishi's considered slice-of-life. That's a good one, so, if you count that as slice-of-life, then yeah. What I'm saying is, although I'm not the biggest fan of romance, I do like tragic romance, especially because I do like tragedy. Obviously, that's why, Devilman is one of my favorite series, because it's, a tragedy. Most of Takeshi's movies are tragedies that also happen to have romance in them. They're usually tragic romances. Again, Fireworks is my favorite movie of all time. It's literally about a guy spending as much time as he possibly can with his wife who's dying of leukemia. Sonatine has a little bit of romance in it. Dolls is a pinnacle of tragic romance because, you know, it has 3 different romance stories, all of which are tragic. I also do tend to like it when the romance has just drama in general. And again, it has to be well done. Because I don't really care about a lot of, like, especially with anime, there's a lot of, like, tropes with romance that I don't like. You know, like the clumsy equals cute. I fucking hate that. You know, when the character, like, falls on top of the girl character, and he, like, lands and grabs her boob. That's, like, a cliche that happens all the time, and I fucking hate it. But I do think that when done right, romance can add to a story. And most stories tend to have at least some romance elements in it. Even horror movies, to an extent, can have romance in them. There's usually a love interest character. You know, plenty of stories that aren't romances have romance in them, so it's like, I'm not against it, it just has to be well done. But I guess that's really my thoughts on that. So in today's episode, I'll be talking about what in my opinion is the best type of anime. Now, anime comes in all shapes and sizes, and one of the things people tend to say about it is, the nice thing about it is there's an anime for everyone, because there's many different types. And there's many different types of types, if you get what I'm saying, because there's genre, style, time frame, themes, all sorts of things that can factor into what we're talking about with types here. There's a lot of, like, battle shonen stuff that gets released now that, in all honesty, I'm kind of burnt out on. I'm just kind of tired of the battle shonen tropes. Like, I watched the first couple seasons of My Hero Academia, and I thought it was fine. But I haven't watched it for a while now, and I just don't know if I really have any interest in going back to it, because battle shonen anime is all just kind of the same, in my opinion. Like, there's differences in, like, characters and plots and themes and stuff like that. But a lot of them just kind of follow the same beats, and they have the same kind of characters, too. Like, nowadays, it's always, like, some wimpy high school student that gains some sort of power and becomes strong over time. It just kind of gets dull when that's all you see. Obviously, that's not all that literally exists. You get my point. It's kind of a trope. That said, I don't hate battle shonen anime. There's quite a few battle shonen animes I've liked. You know, I enjoyed Dragon Ball. I enjoyed Dragon Ball Z and GT as well. I would say Dragon Ball Z is kind of overrated. I think Original and GT are both better personally. I know GT being better is a hot take, but that's because I'm more about adventure than I am about action, and GT kind of took it back to those roots. I acknowledge the flaws it has, but personally I just enjoyed it a hell of a lot more. There are also good battle shonens like Fist of the North Star and JoJo that have, like, the big, like, muscle man protagonists that are really cool. You don't really see that a whole hell of a lot anymore. I definitely think 80s battle shonen is better than modern battle shonen. I've never personally been a fan of, like, the slice of life comedy stuff. There's been exceptions, obviously. There are some comedies I like and some slice of life that I like, and I've been more open about them in recent years. But it's still not my main cup of tea. I'm also not too keen on sports anime. I feel like that's just kind of not my thing either. If you count, like, Initial D as a sports anime, I guess that's the only one that I've really liked. But anyway, enough rambling about the different types. Let's talk about, in my opinion, what is the best type. In my opinion, the best type of anime tends to be 80s and 90s OVAs. Old school OVA one-shots or multi-episode trilogies or four-parters or whatever. Old school OVAs were the shit. I've always found that the art tends to be a lot more to my liking. Like, it's very detailed, but it's not, like, all shiny, and, like, it doesn't have to be, like, the most detailed like it is now. It's just the right amount of detail, in my opinion, with the old school OVAs. And on top of that, they can get away with a lot more because OVAs were released straight to video, so there was often a lot less censorship. So old school OVAs would typically be really violent and over the top and dark and fucked up. And to me, that's anime at its peak. I don't like a lot of the generic, romance crap we get now. When back in the day, we used to just get people getting ripped apart and all sorts of fucked up dark shit happening. That was what I really liked to see. Obviously, my favorite example of these OVAs is the 2-episode Devilman OVA. Technically, there's a 3rd episode that was made 10 years later, being Ammon Apocalypse Devilman. But that was done by a different studio, adapts a spin-off manga, and skips a large chunk of the story. So technically, it's not often considered to be the 3rd episode, although it is by a lot of other people too. And from what I understand, it was intended to be a sequel to the first 2, but regardless, it definitely skips a lot of the story, so I get why it's also often not. There's also a lot of great old-school OVA hentais from back then, too, like Yorotsuki Doji, Demon Warrior Koji, La Blue Girl, basically anything Toshio Maeda did. And then, of course, there's other stuff by Go Nagai as well. There was Violence Jack. New Cutie Honey, which in my opinion is the best version of Cutie Honey, Shootin' Doji, and many more. I also feel like these old school OVAs are the best types of anime to do Go Nagai's work justice, because they tend to be the best adaptations of Go Nagai's works, because they cut out the fluff, but they keep the story more or less intact. And they do make some additions and changes here and there for sure, but I think that overall, that they tend to be the best Go Nagai adaptations. Like, if they'd have done a full series of the Devilman OVAs, it would be so much better than Crybaby. Like, don't get me wrong, Crybaby has its place. I enjoy it for what it is, but it's definitely nothing in comparison to the old school 80s OVAs. 80s and 90s OVAs, rather, because 89 and 90 is when they came out. But instead, we got Chibi Chara Go Nagai World, which was fine. I enjoyed that, too, for what it was, a little gag comedy. But these old school OVAs tend to be my favorite type of anime, personally. I tend to like the darker, more violent types of anime that exist. Obviously, there's plenty of other stuff I enjoy, but that tends to be my favorite. Anyway, I think that's all I'm going to ramble on about here today. So for today's topic of media opinions, I'm going to talk about gatekeeping. And I have done a video on gatekeeping before in the past, although my opinions have actually changed a decent amount on the subject. What exactly is gatekeeping? Well, there's a couple of factors to it. Gatekeeping comes in many forms, but it is often a fan base trying to keep people who are not ideal for the fan base out of a fan base. And I realize I said fan base a ton of times in a sentence there, but there it is. This can take many forms, such as telling people they're not true fans, which I actually think can often be true. Although sometimes I think people can go overboard with it. And in the past, when I did the other video, even then I said that gatekeeping is good for keeping normies out of a fan base and ruining it. Because the truth is, there are a lot of people who will infiltrate fan bases and try to ruin a property to make it so that they can twist it to their own agenda. People who come in and demand that it change are very bad for an intellectual property, especially when it's owned by a corporation who's willing to make those changes and destroy what something is supposed to be. Obviously, I'm pretty cynical when it comes to pop culture nowadays, but I definitely think gatekeeping absolutely has a place. Because gatekeeping isn't simply being elitist. What gatekeeping actually also entails is being the gatekeeper to show people who you know would be a good fit for a franchise to help guide them to that franchise. For instance, I will share things with certain friends of mine, and I won't share certain things with those friends. It just depends on if I think it'll be a good fit and they'll enjoy it for what it is. That's not to say I don't think someone can enjoy something despite of aspects they don't like, because obviously I have plenty of things that I like that I don't like aspects about. Obviously you're not going to fully like anything. But I think in order to keep properties that you enjoy pure, you do have to do at least some degree of gatekeeping, where you sort of help introduce people to it who would be a good fit, and to call out the people who are clearly not fans of that property and are just trying to use it to change it to try and push some sort of social agenda. Gatekeeping is often used as a dirty word, and I just don't think that's fair, because I think it's absolutely essential for maintaining the purity of a property. Again, these may seem like unimportant things, but really culture is important. Culture is the basis for everything in our world, and that includes pop culture. I'd say much more people care about the newest Marvel schlock than any sort of new tax plan or something like that. Much more people care about the newest video game coming out than they do about the pipes in Flint, Michigan, or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, people care much more about pop culture than they do about news and politics. It's just a fact. That's how people typically are. The vast majority of people don't care about what's going on in the world. They just care about what they can consume. And that is why we have to try and keep those properties pure, because when they're not, they're bastardized and raped, and then they're turned into something they're not, and then used to push ideology that is ultimately harmful to us as a society. As I said, I think things can go too far. I think the Undertale fan base can be pretty obnoxious with how elitist they are when it comes to saying you have to play the game a certain way, things like that. And obviously I'm a proponent of things like death of the author, but I also am a person who is in favor of the artist's vision to an extent, which actually will be the subject of probably tomorrow night's video, because I held a poll for whether gatekeeping or the artist's vision would be tonight's, and I think that tomorrow will be the artist's vision, which sort of ties into this, because I do think that having a vision that the creator has is the main purpose of something. But I also think that interpretation is another valid purpose, because again, I obviously interpret things vastly differently than sometimes the author intends. So obviously there's a balance and a nuance, but again, we'll get into that more next time. What I'm really saying here is if you enjoy something, you do need to kind of protect it, because there are plenty of people who want to infiltrate, subvert, and change it. And bringing things to a mass appeal will cause problems, because it will cause normies to come into it, and then they'll come and want it changed, they'll demand it changed, try to cancel it, try to say that people who like it are bad, all sorts of things like that. That's why I really like that Toshio Maida's work kind of naturally gatekeeps itself. Like, obviously there's some normies who are into it, like the Anime Man talked about it once. But the nice thing about Toshio Maida's work is that not only does it have the stigma of being hentai, but it's also rare, out of print, and usually has a price you have to pay that's pretty extensive to buy it. Like, they're usually super expensive and rare. Obviously, there's piracy online and things like that, but for those who are true fans who want it, you gotta spend money for it. And I do think that the high price and rarity of the actual physical releases of much of his work is a good barrier to entry. It's a good gatekeep as well. In addition to the fact that, again, it does also, like I said, have the stigma of being a hentai. Particularly Yorotsuki Doji is, again, I think his best work, but all of his work is at least good. That's why I actually think hentai is probably the purest form of art currently that exists, because the artist's vision is what completely drives it. And it's really hard to demand change for a hentai, because hentai is already such a controversial thing, because it's based completely in, you know, sexual content, or at least that's the theory, right? Obviously, with Toshio Maida, I don't think that's the case. I think that it's a much more expressive and interesting, deep story that he has in the vast majority of his works. But to the average Joe, it's just gonna seem like more anime porn, and that's good, because that's gonna keep him uninterested, and gonna keep it out of the public's eye. As I've said, there's a reason when I like something, I don't want it to come back. I don't want it to get bastardized because studios are going to make it woke. They're going to pretend it's always had some message it never had. They're going to rewrite it. They're going to remove elements that make it what it is. And they're going to fundamentally change it into something that it's not. That's what happens with most modern properties that are adaptations of older properties, and why I typically like the things that I like to stay unknown. Obviously, I don't want them to stay completely unknown. I talk about the things I like all the time on this fucking channel, so obviously that's not completely the case, but you get what I mean. I don't want it to be mainstream. When something is niche, it's special. There's a certain quality to it that you don't get with anything else, because it's purely based on the artistic input of its creators and fan base at the time. It's not just something that comes out of a corporation that's shat out. Spider-Man as a comic, when it started with Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, was great. You look at it now, and it's just a cash cow that's milked endlessly by Disney. Devilman is arguably the most influential manga to the manga genre, and it was super influential on anime, video games as well. Like, anime, video games, and manga would not be where they are if it weren't for Go Nagai and Devilman in particular. But look at Crybaby. It's super modernized and has a bunch of trash in it because it meant to appeal to a mainstream audience. Well, I say mainstream, but it's still got pretty graphic sex scenes and gore, so obviously there's going to be detractors for that reason. But they definitely drastically changed it and brought a whole new fan base to it, which has caused a lot of problems. Just like how Elden Ring brought people's attention to Berserk, who are now demanding that the first chapter be changed because it has rape in it, or because it's, you know, insensitive, or over-the-top and violent. People want to pretend that they're a fan of something when they don't actually know what that something is. Berserk is filled with all sorts of controversial shit, and normies going and finding it is only going to cause problems. Anyway, I think I've said my piece here. Now, today's episode was inspired by a YouTuber I've been watching called Rick Worley, and he does a lot of video essays. He's done a lot of things defending the Star Wars prequels, and poking holes in people's criticism, and defending George Lucas and George Lucas's vision for Star Wars. And while I don't agree with everything he says in those videos, and while I obviously wouldn't agree with him politically, for sure, on some things, because of stuff that he's hinted at here and there, his video essays have been a really refreshing and interesting watch, because he focuses mostly on the artist's vision when it comes to George Lucas, and why the special editions are good in his eyes, and things like that. Now, I guess before we get into the artist's vision, I will give my opinion on the prequels and the special editions, since I brought them up here at the beginning. I really like the prequels. I think they're flawed, but I think that they're actually really fun, and I do like the story, even if there are some issues with it. I do think that Rick Worley made a lot of good points about people's criticisms actually not making sense in some particular instances. For instance, people claiming that Jango Fett's head should have fallen out of his helmet when Boba picked it up, but you literally see his head fall out of the helmet right before that because of the shadow. Small little things like that. But I really do like the prequels, and as far as the special editions go, there's some changes I like, there's some changes I don't. Ultimately, I don't think they ruin the movie, but again, it's a mixed bag. I don't know that I'd go as far as to say the prequels are good movies, because they're certainly very, very flawed, but I do enjoy them and I like them. But that was a good jumping off point for why I wanted to talk about the artist's vision. Because Rick Worley really hammers home the fact that Star Wars is George Lucas's vision, and how movies now don't really have visionary directors that have a movie that they're making for themselves. A lot of the times they're just corporate things where corporations will want to make a movie because something's popular and then they'll just throw a director on it and just have him direct. Whereas all of the best movies tend to have directors that are really attached to them. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are good movies that get made by studios like that. But like Kubrick and Takeshi and Tarantino, all of them have visions and styles that they do, and their movies are their movies, where they are the ones at the helm. And the same was true with Star Wars and Lucas. Even the ones he didn't direct, he still had massive creative control over. And again, we're talking about the original 6, not the god-awful Disney abominations. But obviously, I have very nuanced opinions when it comes to the whole fact of the artist's vision. I do think, at its core, all great art comes from a visionary artist. The best thing for a movie, book, piece of art just in general, is when it's done by someone who is making it for themselves with their own vision. At the same time, I am also one who is a big proponent of, death of the author and interpreting things my own way and things like that. So, obviously I'm not wholesale in saying that the creator is the only one who determines what something means to people, because obviously if that was the case, my interpretation of Watchmen wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, because again, I love Watchmen, but I despise Alan Moore and what he wanted to accomplish with it. But I do think art should be made for the purpose of the artist trying to get their vision out there, and I think that is, at its core, what makes great art. And Rick Worley did make some good points about the fact that Kubrick literally destroyed tons of different cuts of his movies and removed stuff constantly, and you never hear people demanding anything from that. Again, I am torn on this, because I do agree with the fan base in the fact that the fans are the ones who make something stay relevant, but on the other hand, that's not necessarily what the artist is going for. Obviously, I think that art should be done for the purpose of the artist and what they want to accomplish, regardless of what fans want or don't want. However, that will lead to some things being bad, because artists are humans too, they're fallible. But obviously I think that fans should gatekeep and things like that, hence the video we did a couple days ago about gatekeeping. And I ultimately do think that it is fair to call out when something doesn't make sense in a work you like. I do think sometimes Star Wars fans do go a bit overboard with George Lucas, because I do think that George Lucas really did put his heart and soul into all 6 Star Wars movies, and I genuinely do think that the 6 Star Wars movies as they currently exist is the way that George Lucas wanted them to be presented, with the special editions and everything. Obviously, as I said, personally I find the special editions to be a very mixed bag, but I do get that it is what George Lucas currently wants the movies to appear as. It's the way he envisions them now. And the changes he did in the special editions weren't done out of malice, they were done out of him wanting to improve the movie, regardless if that's what they did or not. That said, corporations will get cash cows and milk them and ruin things when they're not creative themselves. So I do think that is also a key difference when it comes to the sequels versus the prequels, because the prequels were still George Lucas making the movies he wanted to make that he cared about, whereas the sequels are absolute garbage. Now that said, I also do think that some people get ahead of themselves and want to be recognized when they shouldn't. Like, there's a lot of voice actors and stuff, in particular when it comes to anime, they get really entitled and will shit on the fans and talk bad about fans and be fucking assholes who think that they're better than us just because they voiced a fucking Japanese cartoon character. And if it's not abundantly clear, I'm talking about Funimation specifically, but I'm sure there's plenty of others because the whole industry's like that. Obviously, voice actors aren't artists either, so I do think that there is something to be said there. But I do think that even an artist should at least acknowledge and be grateful for the fan bases they gain. I'm not saying that they have to. Obviously, they don't owe us anything. And I do think it is wrong to also think that you're owed something by an artist just because they made something you like. Because they made it for them. Regardless if they make more or less or did things you didn't like, that's irrelevant. They made it for them, which I think is admirable. And if it's someone who's truly someone who wants to stick to their art and their vision, I respect the hell out of that regardless of the result. And I definitely have never had, like, a massive fan base myself, so I don't know what that's like either, so I don't know how frustrating that could be if you're constantly getting hounded for shit like that. Obviously, I think if you put stuff out there, you should be willing to deal with it. But at the end of the day, I think that the artist's vision is what matters when they're making art. I do think fan bases have just as much right to criticize and reinterpret things as well. So that's where the nuance comes in. Again, I think that there is nothing wrong with criticizing Star Wars, criticizing the prequels, because again, they are very flawed movies. There's nothing wrong with criticizing the special effects changes that George Lucas did in the original trilogy later on, because again, some of them are pretty bad. Like I said, it's kind of a mixed bag, but there's definitely some bad things in there, like the CGI Rontos and stuff that they threw in, which just doesn't blend well with the original look. Again, in Rick Worley's video, he actually pointed out that even in 77, there were multiple versions of the movie, because there was the test screening version, there was the mono version, the stereo version, the 35mm version, the 70mm version, all of which had very slight differences in them, way before they actually did the remastered ones. I do think some of those could just be splitting hairs, and obviously the special editions are the ones where they completely overhauled it and introduced some of the less than good changes, to say the very least. But there are some changes I think are good. For instance, replacing the Emperor with the actor that he's played by in all the other movies in Empire Strikes Back, because originally it was just a random actor. Or I think the scene with Jabba in A New Hope was actually really cool, because that was originally recorded back in 77, but they didn't have anything to put in that place. So yeah, like I said, I think that fan bases have every right to criticize and have their own interpretations and opinions of things. Obviously, I think those fan bases should gatekeep to keep things pure. But I also think that at the end of the day, the artist's vision is what matters the most when the artist is making work. And that may or may not off-put fans when they put it out, but you know what? That's the way that art works. Anyway, I think that's really all I have to say. I would recommend you guys check out Rick Worley's channel. I've actually been enjoying him quite a bit. Today's episode of Media Opinions is a follow-up to last night's video, which was a rant on the Steam pulling its support of Windows 7. And so that you won't actually be able to play your games on a Windows 7 computer anymore, even though you bought the games. Hey, future Red Eye here. I don't plan on editorializing a ton in this Season 1 upload, but at the time of the recording or editing of this compilation of Season 1, so, you know, technically it's May 10th, 2025, because it's after midnight, my games do still work. I just can't buy any new ones, but I can buy ones that existed before they stopped support, for now. Obviously, I already did a rant on that, so we're not going to get too in-depth on that, but this is a follow-up to that. So as such, the subject of today is PC gaming versus console gaming. Now, if you've been watching my channel for an extended period of time, then you know that I am a console gamer. I don't like the term gamer, but, you know, it is what it is. I play games on console. And PC gaming, I do a little bit as well. Now, something I've always noticed is that PC gamers will always bring up the fact that the PCs have better hardware, and you can do more with them, and there's mod support, things like that, obviously, right? And those are all obviously positives for PC gaming. But here's the thing with that. That's only one aspect. You're talking completely technical on that point. There are lots of other aspects that go into PC versus console gaming. And while I've grown to like PC gaming a lot more, I've been a little soured since the other day, obviously, because, you know, Steam not being able to work on Windows 7 anymore. Granted, we have until the beginning of next year, and I can theoretically get Windows 10 on this computer, but I don't want to lose anything. And I don't like Windows 10. Like I said, Windows 10 basically feels like malware with how intrusive it is, and it doesn't let you do as much with it. Again, I don't plan on editorializing a ton in this. However, I did just want to say that Windows 11 is even worse than Windows 10. Fuck Windows 11. It's like a Mac OS on a Windows computer, and I fucking hate it. My work computers have it now on most of them, and a lot of them have issues now because of that. But that's a whole other argument. But it does go into one of my points. And one of the points I have with PC gaming is you constantly have to upgrade your stuff. And this is something that PC gamers just take as a given. They just take it as a given that it's totally normal for games and game launchers to pull support, not only from existing operating systems, because obviously that's what kind of spiraled me to do this, but new games you're constantly having to update your hardware and your software frequently to do it. To a point where eventually you have to replace your whole computer. And computers are not cheap. The computer I have and I'm recording this on and I use costs $1,400 to build. Now granted, I didn't pay that much for it. I paid Kyler $800 for it after he upgraded to another one. So with that being said, I still spent $800 on this, so that's still a good amount of money. So getting another one would be ridiculous. Obviously, I'm not at the stage where I would need to get another one. In theory, I would just have to upgrade to Windows 10, which would mean I'd have to buy a whole new operating system and install it, and then hopefully not lose any of the apps and shit I have on here, because a lot of them aren't on Windows 10. You can't get Movie Maker anymore. I mean, I've used Movie Maker on Windows 10, because I actually do have a laptop that has Windows 10. It's a piece of shit laptop, by the way, which is ironic. So, you know, Steam isn't going to work on this computer that's fast and runs really well just because it has Windows 7. But my old shitty piece of shit laptop that you have to wait like 5 minutes to load anything anymore, that'll still work with it because it has Windows 10. That's somehow more suited, even though it's a total piece of shit. Again, I know I keep harping on this point, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much longer because, like I said, it's only one thing, but it is what spiraled me to do this video in the first place. But in addition to constantly having to update that sort of stuff, you do have to update your PC hardware on a regular basis. Consoles nowadays do update their software, which, you know, it does do that, It just does it in the background. You don't have to upgrade the hardware. Here's the thing. My Xbox 360, if I turn it on right now and hook it up, it'll still connect to Xbox Live. It'll still let me play my games online. It is still supported, even though it's really fucking old hardware that I've had since 2009. More editorializing, but that hasn't aged the best, given the fact that Xbox 360's store is no longer supported, and then the Halo servers have also been shut down, although they might have been at the time I did the video. I don't fucking remember at this point when exactly this episode was made, because I'm not looking at that right now. It doesn't matter. Point is, you can still play a lot of 360 games online, but you can't, like, go on this Xbox 360 marketplace anymore, unfortunately. That's right, my original 360 still works. Now, granted, the disk drive doesn't work on that anymore, and my new Xbox couldn't connect to Xbox Live because it's a JTAG, my new 360 specifically, but the point is, 360s can still get online and play video games. And you know, once a computer hits a certain age, it can no longer connect to the internet. But another point that's connected to the Steam thing is everything on PC goes through fucking launchers now, whether it be Steam, whether it be Epic Games, whether it be GOG. Those are just some of the ones out there that require a launcher to do DRM. Here I am at this stage in the editing process, editorializing way more than I thought I would, but correction, GOG does actually not have DRM, and it'll let you just save it directly to the hard drive, so GOG's actually pretty good. You can't just buy a disc and pop it in anymore. Physical media on PC is basically dead. There's a few that you can still get here and there, but it's not a thing anymore. On console, sure, now you have to install the disc on modern consoles, but you can still get the disc, and it can install it while being offline and still work just fine. I guess the main point I'm making is consoles are just more convenient, and there's less shit that can go wrong with them. PCs let you do more, it's true. Like I said, there are absolutely benefits to PC gaming, and like I said, I was warming up to it, and having a lot of fun with it. And I still will for at least the rest of this year, and then after that we'll figure it out. If I eventually cave and get Windows 10, which, you know, could happen, or maybe I'll put in another CPU or hard drive. I don't know, I'm going to have Kyler help me with it, because I'm not too bright with computers, to be perfectly honest. I'll have him help me with it, maybe, and maybe I can run parallel, so I have Windows 10 and Windows 7 on here, so I can edit with 7, but still, like, do my games on 10. That's always a possibility, and that wouldn't be the end of the world. It's still fucking frustrating that I would have to even consider doing something like that, because Windows 7, I like. It's slick and it works well. But since everything runs through these fucking launchers on PC, you don't ever actually own your games. Steam can remove it at any moment. Like, in theory, Steam could just say, sorry, we don't allow you to play this game anymore. They could do that. And again, since I have an older computer with Windows 7, they can do that to me. Like I said, this computer is still good enough that I could put Windows 10 on it, but that's only a solution for now, until Windows comes up with something that this computer can't have, which I don't know if it can have Windows 11. So that could be another issue if they eventually phase out Windows 10, because I know they're discontinuing Windows 10 itself in 2025. I don't know if they're going to discontinue support that quickly, but they tend to do that. Another thing is Microsoft increasingly uses subscription services for everything. Like Microsoft Word, you don't just buy and have anymore. Instead, now you have to pay for it either monthly or yearly. Now, granted, I have Microsoft Word on my laptop that I don't have to pay for because it's Microsoft Word 2013 that you just bought and have. But on this computer, I do still have, you know, Office software. I just use OpenOffice because it's fucking free. Most of the shit I use is free. I like free shit. I'm a cheapskate. I'm also very stubborn, and I'm all about functionality over performance. I don't care that much about graphics. That's another thing, is, you know, with PC, the argument is graphics are objectively better on PC. Sure. But I use an old fucking TV as a monitor on here, so obviously I'm not going to get the full extent of no matter what, so it doesn't matter. But I think it's just crazy that people just take it as a given that whenever Microsoft releases new shit that you require, you just have to go buy it. You just have to do that. It's just an excuse for Microsoft to make you buy more shit. I don't know, it just seems like Microsoft has PC gamers kind of cucked on that. Like, they're just like, oh yeah, you gotta update your shit now. You gotta upgrade your hardware, you gotta update your software, you gotta do all this over and over and over again. And like I said, it's not like consoles don't update their software. I'm not completely oblivious to that fact. But it's a lot more extensive with computers, and sometimes those updates fuck shit up. Now granted, sometimes updates fuck shit up on console too. Like I said, I'm not gonna be completely stubborn and say that there's no parallel between the two. But at least with consoles, like I said, I can still get physical discs. And the oldest Xbox One can still work, and the 360 can still work online. Again, it's funny, most of this video I haven't done any editorializing, but one thing that is irritating is Xbox only makes games now for the Series X and Series S. Also, physical games are obviously becoming much less common on consoles as well. PS4 still makes games, so that's pretty cool, but we'll see how long that lasts. I know that's kind of being phased out too. But there you go. Console does have its own set of issues that is arising as well. And as far as, like, actually owning your games, you go back to the very first consoles, right? The Atari 2600 or whatever. That's not like the first console. Obviously, the Magnavox Odyssey was the first home console. And even then, you can still play the games on the fucking Magnavox Odyssey, providing the damn thing still works. But the reason that Steam is doing that is apparently Steam goes through Google Chrome, which apparently will no longer function on it as well. So maybe I'll have to switch to another browser as well if I decide to stay stubborn and stick with this. Again, more post-editorializing, so sorry about that. However, I did just want to say that Google Chrome still works for me as of now during this editing. However, it doesn't get updates. I do have to use Firefox when I want to watch like my videos in my Amazon library, or if I want to watch stuff on Amazon Prime. But other than that, Chrome still works more or less. Like I said, I realize that eventually Windows 7 will be completely phased out. I just want to ride it as long as I fucking can, because I fucking love Windows 7. It's so good. But I'm going to bring up a couple comments. So, first off, to be fair, it's Microsoft you're talking about. Microsoft is known for doing stuff like that, and the only computer company that does this, and I don't know what he's talking about. Because Mac updates their software all the time, too. Like, granted, Mac is a little bit more, like, dumbed down and, like, just kind of does it like that. Like, I don't really know how Mac works all that well, to be perfectly honest. But, like, what's he comparing it to? There's Mac and there's Linux. And Linux is all, like, custom shit that people do when they're programmers. So, I mean, granted, there's also, like, prepackaged Linux you can get. I don't have Linux. I'm not too familiar with it. Like I said, I'm not a big computer guy. But then I brought up the fact that it was Steam doing it, not Windows. And then, of course, he brought up, well, but it's a Windows computer. Which, you know, that's true, but that's... And it is Windows that did update to Windows 10, so in a way it is Microsoft too, and I'm not going to pretend it's not. But I don't have that problem with the Xbox. And then I said, that's a dumb position that PC gamers just accept. The Xbox 360 is still playable both offline and online. My computer is fast and works really well. It's just a bad excuse for Microsoft to force people to buy more stuff. Because that's what he was saying, you know, about it being an older computer, and it's not surprising that it's not going to work. Which, again, this computer could work with Windows 10. That's not the issue. But in response to my response there, he said, one, the reason why Xbox 360 can still handle online is because a lot of people still play it to this very day, and that's not entirely true. It's not necessarily untrue. With backwards compatibility, there's still plenty of people that play it. But the actual 360, I'm willing to bet it is a marginal amount that still play it online. I don't even still play it online, and I insisted I was going to, so, you know, I do play 360 games on my Xbox One X because that's just so much more convenient that I can just do it all on here, which is great, by the way. And I like that it just emulates the 360 OS when you do that. And to be fair, the 360 OS updated multiple times too. Like I said, I'm not pretending it's not a completely foreign concept to consoles. He said, too, not very many people play on those computers, and I don't know if that's true. I think plenty of people probably still use Windows 7 or Windows 8 or 8.1. I'm sure that still happens. Like, I'm sure I'm not the only one who doesn't like Windows 10. And then he said, 3, if you don't want this to become an issue, then how about just buy another Windows computer, which, again, there's no point. I could just upgrade this to 10 if I wanted to, or run it parallel. Make another Steam account, and you're good. And it's like, maybe he doesn't understand how Steam works, but wouldn't need another Steam account. I can literally sign in on another computer. What are you talking about? So then I told him, oh, that's a dumb argument. I'm going to put it in my video. But overall, like I said, consoles, I think, are more convenient. PCs definitely are better for performance and things like that, and I do like PC gaming, and mouse and keyboard has absolutely grown on me. I love playing Fallout 3 with mouse and keyboard. But I just kind of wanted to follow up on the rant and kind of talk about PC versus console. Like I said, I tend to side on console. In fact, it's kind of funny, because I'm so ass backwards with it. My emulators are all on a modded original Xbox. And when I play ROM hacks, I typically buy a physical cartridge of the fucking ROM hack and then play it on my Retron. I do things so weird compared to most people. I'm a very stubborn and odd person when it comes to technology, and I fully acknowledge that. In today's episode, I'll be talking about the concept of guilty pleasures. Now, guilty pleasures is a term I hear get used from time to time, and I kind of use it a little bit differently than a lot of people do, I think. A lot of people will use it to apply to so bad it's good things, but I've always just liked to use the term so bad it's good for that. Because to me the term guilty implies some level of shame or embarrassment in enjoying it. But I never get that with so bad it's good movies. Everyone's on the same page with why those are enjoyable. People might disagree on what is so bad it's good, but at the very least we kind of get the concept, you know what I mean? Like, I love so bad it's good movies. The Room? Great. Neil Breen? Great. I have a personal soft spot for Howard the Duck as well. I even like movies that are intentionally, like, bad and stupid sometimes. Like, Velocipaster was pretty fun, but it was very clearly made to be like that. Or there's companies like Troma who revel in making things that are intentionally shitty. I love Troma. Troma is my favorite film studio. And then, of course, there's things like Sharknado, which I don't even view to be in the same category at all, because it's very clearly a satire making fun of shark movies. And I think a lot of people are far too quick to dismiss that series because they think it's just, oh, it's intentionally bad, which it's like, yeah, it's a parody. Which I think you could also kind of make the argument with things like Velocipaster, but it's a little different. Then, of course, there's, things like Jack Frost and stuff like that, which are absolutely, parodies, but they're also intentionally made to be cheesy and over the top. My point is, none of these things are what I would call guilty pleasures for me. Like I said, guilty pleasures are something that I don't really use as a term very often, just because I take issue with the framing of it. There are literally only two things I can think of that I have ever labeled an actual guilty pleasure for me. Those things being the Medea movies and Y2K, a postmodern RPG. And let me explain my reasoning behind both of those things, and why I would call those guilty pleasures. Okay, Future Red Eye again, with the one piece of editorializing I knew I was going to do. Because all the stuff I'm about to say in this old video about Y2K, or YIK, is completely inaccurate to what I think now. If you guys have watched me for a while, you know I became quite a huge fan of YIK and have done several other videos on it since then, and 1.5 makes it even better than that. So just take everything I say and just disregard it here, because YIK is not a guilty pleasure, it's a fucking great game. The way that I define guilty pleasures, it's not that I feel shame or embarrassment for liking these things, and it is true that I do find these things ironic in part of my appreciation for them. In fact, I will say I also think probably Limp Bizkit falls into this category as well. Although with Limp Bizkit, it's a little bit different. Limp Bizkit, it's a little bit genuine, a little bit ironic. I think with Limp Bizkit, it's almost like it's so bad it's good, but I also can kind of appreciate it sometimes. But the reason I would call these guilty pleasures is because, for me, a guilty pleasure is something you're not really quite sure why you like it. The Medea movies, for example, are fucking terrible and always have the same ham-fisted message. Not to mention, the comedy is very much the same and repetitive and not that great, but for whatever reason, I have watched a really high amount of these movies, and have enjoyed them. That's not to say that there are no jokes that are redeeming and stuff like that in these movies, because obviously there is, otherwise I probably wouldn't have watched them. But I can't quite place the reason why I've enjoyed these movies. There's no logical reason for it. Now with Y2K, it's a little bit different. I actually genuinely like this game. I'm fucking obsessed with it. I don't know why, I just am. I think for me, it is genuinely partially genuine and partially ironic. Obviously the game is bad in many ways, but there are quite a few things I can appreciate it just because you can tell the guy who made it genuinely cares about it. For reasons I am absolutely not clear on, one of the things I look forward to the most is the Y2K 1.5 update. I love this game, and I have no idea why. It's frustrating, repetitive, the combat has bullshit stuff with some of the boss fights, but it's great. I've already done a whole review on this game, and I've talked about it a couple other times on the channel, so you guys know that I like this game, and I also acknowledge that it's bad in quite a few ways. But yeah, to me a guilty pleasure is something that you like, but you're not sure why. That's kind of the way I define a guilty pleasure, or something that you have a very weird, ambivalent like for. That you both like it and hate it at the same time, in a sense. I think for me, that's what a guilty pleasure is. So, like I said, for me, the only things I would really consider guilty pleasures are the Medea movies, even though I haven't watched the last few, because they look too bad even for me. And Y2K, I genuinely do really like. Like I said, Limp Bizkit, it almost falls into that so bad it's good category. Limp Bizkit might count as a guilty pleasure. I don't know, it's not a term I use a lot. Like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of using the term guilty pleasure, but it is a fun thought to think about and what I would consider to be a guilty pleasure. But anyway, that's all I really have to say for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. In this episode, I wanted to talk about sequels, or more to the point, what constitutes sequels. I thought I did a video like this already, but I guess it was probably part of a shit show, and I probably focused a lot more on Violence Jack with it. But I wanted to talk about it because it's interesting what we will and won't be willing to be called a sequel. For instance, I will often refer to Deltarune as Undertale's sequel, but a lot of people won't do that. I myself have no problem calling it a sequel and will continue to do so. And there's 3 reasons for that. Reason number 1, it pisses off the people who don't. Same reason, which is always partially a reason for why I do some of the things I do. Reason number 2, which is much more tangible, is it actually ties into my theory of what Deltarune is, right? I think that Deltarune is a sequel. I have my own theories about it. My theory is that Deltarune is a post-genocide world that was recreated either by Kara or Gaster or some other force. But, again, if we focus too much on Deltarune, that's going to get us here all day. But the third reason is what made me decide to make this topic. And that's, there's plenty of other things we're willing to call sequels, even if they're just objectively not. Let me give 2 examples that are actually prequels, but we call them sequels. There's Red Dead Redemption 2, and there's Vacancy 2: The First Cut. One of which is a video game, as I'm sure you are all aware. The other of which is a movie, which I actually think is better than the original. I actually quite like Vacancy 2: The First Cut, and I find the first Vacancy movie to be kind of boring. But Vacancy 2: The First Cut, as I said, is a prequel, but it's still called Vacancy 2. Just like how Red Dead Redemption 2 is a prequel, but yet, again, it is also still called Red Dead Redemption 2. I have no problem calling these sequels. I mean, they're follow-ups, so I mean, right, kinda, but I mean, they are literally prequels. They're not actually sequels, right? Because a sequel would typically, we would think, be like the next thing in the sequence, right? There's plenty of other standalone sequels that we're willing to just call sequels, right? For instance, you take Silent Night, Deadly Night, Part 4 and 5. They're kind of sequels, right? They're 4 and 5, but guess what? They're completely different movies because it's an anthology series. But they're still labeled as quote-unquote standalone sequels, even though, again, they have nothing to do with the first 3 movies. And that's when we get into the topic of things like spiritual successors as well, right? For instance, with Red Dead Redemption, that wasn't the first Red Dead game. There was Red Dead Revolver. But Red Dead Redemption is often considered the spiritual successor to that rather than the sequel. Even though the prequel to Red Dead Redemption is called the sequel. It's kind of like how I don't... It's also like how I... Another example is I absolutely consider The Simpsons Hit and Run the sequel to The Simpsons Road Rage, especially since it was originally supposed to be. But probably a lot of people would say it's not because the gameplay is drastically different. This, of course, wouldn't hold up under scrutiny from the same people, though, if they look at Postal 1 versus the rest of the Postal series. Very different gameplay. Not to mention, there's the Dark Cloud series. There's Dark Cloud and Dark Cloud 2. Dark Cloud 2 is not called Dark Cloud 2 everywhere, it's called Dark Chronicle, and it's a completely unrelated story, but with the same gameplay and similar settings and characters. But it doesn't tie into the original like at all. Like I said, some places it's not even called Dark Cloud 2, it's called Dark Chronicle. And then you get to crazy stuff like Italian unofficial standalone sequels that are made for movies. For instance, do you know how many fucking unofficial Evil Dead sequels there are in Italy? At least 2 that I know of, Ghost House and Witchery. Because the series is rebranded as La Casa in Italy, and Ghost House and Witchery are literally just called La Casa 3 and 4. 4 and 5, respectively. So, there's at least 2 unofficial Evil Dead sequels there. Not to mention the Zombie series, which started as an unofficial sequel to Dawn of the Dead, which started as an unofficial sequel to George Romero's Dead series, you know, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, that series. In fact, that series is called Zombie in Italy, or at least it was. I don't know if that's still the case, but there's a bunch of those Italian unofficial sequels from back in the day. Not to mention, did you know in some parts of Asia, the movie Stan Helsing is called Scary Movie 5? Even though it's completely unrelated, it's just a similar movie made by the same studio. Like, none of the original creative staff is involved. None of the creative staff of the sequels to Scary Movie are involved. But it was published by the same studio and follows a lot of the same tropes and is the same kind of movie. So they literally just call it Scary Movie 5 in a lot of Asia. Never mind the fact that there already is a Scary Movie 5 that came out after Stan Helsing, mind you, so I wonder if they called that Scary Movie 6 over there. If I go too much on this tangent, I'm going to sound like AVGN with his chronologically confused thing. You know, like when he talked about the Final Fantasies being misnumbered here and stuff like that, and even brought up Zombie in that video. So to steer it sort of back towards where I started, interesting other thing about Deltarune, you know Toby Fox came up with Deltarune before he came up with Undertale? Undertale was more used as like a proof of concept, right? Like it was to prove that he could make a game. And again, switching gears yet again, because hey, this is a Fugitive Red Eye video, so why stay on track? But plenty of people were a lot more unwilling to call Violence Jack a sequel to Devilman for a long time. Some of those people have lightened the fuck up about it now that they've actually seen the ending. Because the ending to Violence Jack was eventually fan-translated, even though large chunks of the middle still haven't been. I, of course, own the manga in its entirety in the original Japanese. But it's funny to me that so many people didn't realize Violence Jack was a sequel. They literally said, using a Go Nagai quote that I'm not even sure is real, that I've only ever seen on wikis, where he allegedly said that Violence Jack isn't canon to anything other than itself, which only means that it's a separate timeline. That doesn't fucking mean that it's not a sequel, because Devilman was always canon to Violence Jack, regardless if Violence Jack is canon to literally anything else. And, of course, you know, there was the fact that it wasn't a sequel until the end, which isn't entirely true. There were little bits of it bleeding in here and there for a lot of the later volumes, but it didn't full-on become a sequel till the end. But here's the thing. The canon official sequel, Devil Lady, doesn't become a sequel till halfway through. So again, people pick and choose. Another movie that I always call a sequel, but a lot of people don't, and it's actually left up to debate for a lot of people, is Shock Treatment, the follow-up to the Rocky Horror Picture Show that was originally going to be a much more direct sequel called Rocky Horror Shows His Heels. But they reworked it and only had a couple of characters still in it. They had Riff Raff, Magenta, and the Criminologist. Now, some people might say it's debatable whether Riff Raff and Magenta are actually in it, because they're never actually called that, but it's the same actors, they're playing effectively the same characters. They just cut out the scene where it reveals it's them from the script. It's literally them. And though Brad and Janet were recast, they're in the movie too, and they're the main characters. So it's got the same main characters, and it's got 3 returning cast members, all of which are playing the same characters. And again, you can argue with me if it's actually Riff Raff and Magenta. It absolutely is. You know, on a semi-unrelated note, you know, it's funny to me that I've known people that didn't realize that Devil's Rejects was a sequel to House of a Thousand Corpses. I literally had someone argue with me that even though it had the same characters, and they were the exact same characters, and then they referenced scenes from the first movie, that it wasn't a sequel. Most people don't argue that. It's one of those ones that people say don't realize is a sequel. Same thing with Army of Darkness. It's like, if you've seen all those movies, you absolutely realize they're a sequel. But yeah, this has been getting really rambly and off topic and all over the place, because that's just kind of the way this one turned out. Point is, there's a lot of complexity as to whether we call something a sequel or not. And at the end of the day, as long as I know what you're talking about, I don't give a shit if you call it a sequel or not. A sequel can be a follow-up, or it can actually be the next part in a sequence. So, to me, Deltarune is absolutely the sequel to Undertale. Some people will argue it. Some really retarded people will try to argue that Violence Jack isn't the sequel to Devilman when it absolutely is. And in all honesty, it's the best of the Devilman sequels. And then people will be okay with Red Dead Redemption 2, even though it's a prequel. Like I said, people are interesting with that. But I don't really have a solid definitive answer on this one. Just thought I'd pick your guys' brain and kind of throw myself all over the place, sounding like a fucking gibbering idiot. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about RPGs, which are short for role-playing games if you live under a fucking rock. I've played my share of RPGs on the channel. I've played the Fallout games on the channel quite a bit, Elder Scrolls, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Chrono Trigger, Undertale, Deltarune. I've done a shit show talking about RPGs. I did a top 20 RPGs video, which, funnily enough, is titled Top 10 RPGs, and the thumbnail even says 10, but in the video it's actually 20. But RPGs are one of my favorite genres of video games, Fallout 3 being my current favorite game. I do tend to like a lot of Bethesda RPGs, Elder Scrolls and Fallout. I enjoy most of the games for one reason or another, with my favorites being Fallout 3, Morrowind, New Vegas, Oblivion, and Skyrim. Knights of the Old Republic was one of the early RPGs I got into. It was one of the first ones I played through. It's one of my all-time favorite games. I've done playthroughs of it on the channel before. But part of what I love about RPGs is the element of choice. That's why I like RPGs. Now, obviously, there's a lot that goes into RPGs. Some of the choice aspects aren't there in all of them to the same degree. Sometimes it's just because of the way you play the game. Being turn-based is often a type of combat that they will have. Having a level-up system, things like that. So sometimes it's actually kind of hard to define what exactly is an RPG. For instance, is The Legend of Zelda an RPG? One could argue it has a lot of the elements, but it doesn't have, you know, like, side quests. Actually, I think some of them do have side quests. Ocarina of Time might have side quests. Because I know there's that really big sword, like the giant knife you can get. But there's still things that seem to be missing, so it's almost like an RPG, but it's also almost like it's not. I counted it in my top 20 RPGs video, which, by the way, that video is also super outdated, because Fallout 3 is much lower on it than it would be now, considering it's currently my favorite game. I'm probably going to do a new version, but, like, what makes an RPG, right? Is it the element of choice? Is it the leveling system? That's always a hard thing to define, like, what makes something in that genre. But I've always loved that. One thing I love about RPGs as well is just being able to be a complete and total evil piece of shit. And I've always hated when people are against doing things like that, and just, it's anti-fun to me, where you're not, like, gonna go and do what you want. Because part of what makes being evil in a video game fun is it's a video game, right? It's not real. It's fun to roleplay as an evil character, hence the role-playing game. I've played Knights of the Old Republic so many times, and I tend to play Dark Side more than I play Light Side because it's fun. In Fallout 3, I often blow up Megaton. In New Vegas, I always drop the fucking ICBMs in Lonesome Road. I always just fucking let it go full steam ahead and hit the NCR. I've never played, like, a tabletop RPG. I have plenty of friends who have. I did want to play D&D sometime with Spencer, but then he moved, so then we never got around to that. Also, Corbin and I are thinking of coming up with our own tabletop RPG sort of rules. That could be fun. It's interesting, when I did my RPGs list, there was a lot of people, like, a lot of things that were put on lists that I saw online that were just not RPGs. Like, some things put Halo 2 as an RPG, and it's like, I can't think of a single argument to call Halo 2 an RPG. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Then again, I included Telltale games on that list, because I said, you know, I did a poll, and they said kind of. But Telltale games really aren't RPGs, they're just interactive stories. But yeah, like I said, I love being evil in RPGs. The Genocide route is my favorite Undertale route. I love the Snowgrave route in Deltarune Chapter 2 as well. I honestly think Snowgrave is actually more interesting than Genocide, because you're manipulating someone else into committing the genocide for you. Another RPG series I've come to really enjoy has been the Pokemon games. Now granted, the vast majority of the ones I've played have actually been ROM hacks, but I've still loved them nonetheless. Not to mention, I did play through Crystal, albeit using a Game Shark to give myself the team I wanted right at the start. And I have been playing through Emerald as well, although with another gimmick being that I have every Pokemon level 100 shiny. But I quite like the Pokemon games, even though they're simplistic, and I like the uniqueness, because I like RPGs with a unique way of handling the level system and stuff. I think of Fallout 3 as the gold standard, right, with it being EXP, perks, karma, things like that. But I do like when things mix it up, like in how in the Elder Scrolls, there's no EXP. It's all based on skill, right? Like your skills. Like your blade skill, or your magic skills, things like that, your destruction, your archery, whatever. That's what I love about Morrowind, which I used to actually have a problem with, because I thought, oh, the hit detection's bad in this game. No, that's the feature. What it is you're less likely to hit with a lower skill. It makes sense. It's like a roll of the dice, right? It's like a turn-based game with a chance to miss, except it's not turn-based and you're just swinging the weapon. It's interesting. KOTOR also has really unique combat, where it is also kind of a dice roll, but it like has auto-attack. Now granted, I never just do the auto-attack, I always just spam critical strike. But that is the way it works. A lot of people don't like that. It's something I enjoy because I'm used to the game, but I can understand why people can be put off with that combat, although I actually like it. And that's part of why I wouldn't want to be interested in a remake, because they're probably going to change that. Although they could make the combat better. The real reason I'm not interested in a remake is because the original's great, and I have no reason to play a remake. Especially since they'd probably throw in a bunch of new age bullshit, change a bunch of things. You know, how they always do with shit like that now. But I don't think that remake's gonna fucking happen, just like I don't think the Switch port is ever gonna be fixed to where it's fucking playable. Like, the Nintendo Switch port, once you beat Onderon, the game crashes and you can't beat it. And they were also supposed to add in, like, all of the cut content to the Switch version, but again, it doesn't look like that's gonna fucking happen. I've never been much for MMOs. I'm okay with RPGs having multiplayer, like Fable 2, I think, handled it really well. Fable 2 is one of my favorite RPGs as well. But the way that you can just join multiplayer, but one character is still the hero, the other one is just a character, I like the way they handled that, because then there's still the main character in it. MMOs, I never really got into. I played a little bit of World of Warcraft briefly, but I would always just end after the 20-day trial. The only thing that was really close to an MMO that I played was Phantasy Star Universe, and I played that quite a bit during the demo, obviously. I did a whole Nostalgic Gaming Stories episode on it. Because to me, I like RPGs where you're the single player, you're the main character, and you can basically become a god. You become so overpowered that, you know, through skill and leveling up, you can be all-powerful. I like that. And MMOs nerfed the shit out of that, which is why I hated the Elder Scrolls Online in comparison to the other Elder Scrolls games. Not to mention there's messes like Fallout 76, which everyone already knows is bad, but, anyway, I think I've rambled on enough. So, theories, right? That's something I've dabbled with on the channel, right? As far as responding to bad cartoon theories as part of my Red Eye Responds series. In addition to that, you know, I've talked about things like death of the author and interpreting things in a way that the author may not have liked and things like that. Kind of like how I love Watchmen, but for the kind of the exact opposite reason than Alan Moore would want me to. And things like that, right? Like, I have my own interpretations of things to an extent, and I think we all kind of do. Hence, you know, the death of the author thing. And, you know, I also kind of talked about the opposite of it, with the artist's vision, and how that's, like, the most important thing when it comes to making art and stuff like that. I've also been playing a lot of Y2K, which itself is a game that you gotta do a lot of theorizing, because, again, the story isn't spoon-fed to you, right? Like, the game itself is very metaphorical and cryptic with its story to an extent, with its unconventional storytelling. And so things like that do get gears turning in your head where you're trying to figure out what's going on. So, that said, I'm not against theories wholesale. There actually is some fun to be had in fan theories. For instance, one of my favorite fan theories is in the Blair Witch Project, the theory that the two guys lured the girl out into the woods there as an excuse to murder her, and that there actually was no Blair Witch. It was just those two guys messing with her and ultimately taking her life. That's a very different way to interpret the movie than when I watched it the first time, but I can't not think of that anytime I watch it now because it makes way more sense with the stuff that the guys do throughout the movie. Another example of a theory that I really like is the theory that Star Platinum is actually Jonathan Joestar. Now, the only things to substantiate this are some ambiguous lines that Jonathan said, and the fact that Star Platinum and Jonathan both do aura, 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 but kind of differently than each other. Nevertheless, I like to accept this one just because it makes it a very fitting conclusion to part 3 of JoJo, if you imagine that Star Platinum is Jonathan. But, as there are good fan theories, there are also a lot, and I do mean a fucking lot, of terrible fan theories. For instance, there's the fan theory that Kara is the good guy in Undertale. I did a whole video on this fucking terrible theory, and it's fucking terrible. Every piece of dialogue in the game directly tells you the exact opposite, and people are like, no, but it's criticizing you, the player. It's like, sure, in a meta sense, but that doesn't magically make the child who wanted to destroy the world and wanted to start a war with humans, which, by the way, people in my comments said, oh, she didn't want to start a war with humans, she wanted to end it. Then why the fuck did Azrael say that it would have started a war with humanity? Why did Azrael say that if that wasn't the case? Not to mention, you think that wiping out the rest of humanity is somehow a preferable alternative? You think that that somehow makes it less bad? God, people are fucking stupid when it comes to that. Or, like, when people think that Satan is the actual good guy in Devilman. There's so many things where people are like, well, the villain is actually the good guy. And, like, look, I'm all for death of the author, and I'm all for interpretation, but sometimes you're just pulling shit that just isn't there and can't by any reasonable metric be gleaned. Like, there is nothing that would lead you to believe that Kara is a good guy. There is nothing that would lead you to believe that Satan is the good guy in Devilman. He's a sympathetic villain. But that doesn't make him the good guy. That doesn't make God the villain. God is the villain in some of the sequels, sure. I'll concede that. God is the villain in Demon Lord Dante, absolutely, but Demon Lord Dante's kind of shit. Like, that's a hot take, maybe, but Demon Lord Dante is kind of shit. Like, I like the anime, and the manga's good, too, to an extent, but the ending is fucking terrible, and I hate it. Like, the ending to Demon Lord Dante, like, the entire second half of Demon Lord Dante is kind of stupid. Not to mention, the time when God is depicted as a villain in Devilman Lady is, like, the worst written chapter, and it literally happens in a matter of seconds, where Satan shows up, says, hey, help me fight God, and then Devilman's just like, yeah, okay, let's fight God. With no reason. Like, given the ending of Devilman, which I'm doing very carefully not to spoil here, because I usually pretty openly spoil it, Devilman would have no reason to help Satan. If anything, he would want to fucking kill him right then and there, given the ending of Devilman. So, it just makes no sense that he would immediately just be like, yeah, let's go fight God. Which, I know I bitch about the ending to Devilman Lady all the time, but it's so fucking stupid. But anyway, that's a whole tangent. Let's actually get back to the theories. One type of theory that I absolutely hate that happens all the time is the it was all a coma, it was all a dream, it was all a hallucination, or they're all in purgatory type theory. Now granted, the purgatory and coma dream are a little different, but functionally they're kind of the same. A lot of the times with the purgatory one, you'll get shit that's really fucking reaching, like the Ed, Edd and Eddy theory, where they're like, oh, Kevin must have died in a bike crash because he's always with his bike. Never mind the fact that he's literally not always with his bike, and in fact, he's probably depicted more without his bike than he is with it. I can't confirm that, but I can honestly think of tons of episodes where his bike is never fucking shown. Then they just take surface-level traits of each of the Ed, Edd and Eddy characters and try to say, oh, well, they actually died in this time period because of this. And again, all of them are really reaching. It's like, Eddie's greedy, therefore he died in the Great Depression. Like, what level of fucking reach do you have to get there? Another one is, like, the Rugrats theory, right? Where it says, oh, the Rugrats are figments of Angelica's imagination. Which, first off, no. Angelica wasn't even in the pilot episode, and there's several episodes where Angelica isn't there. Susie talks to the babies, too. The parents interact with their children all the time. Maybe they can't see and hear them talk, and you could argue that's the hallucination, but Susie can! Not to mention, you bring up all grown up, and that just throws a wrench in that whole thing. Also, like, the Rugrats theory comes up with ways that, like, the babies died, too, where they're like, Tommy was stillborn. Chucky died with his mom. Then how do you explain the fact that the parents interact with and parent their babies all the time? Like, what the fuck? Like, I know that they're absent and shit like that a lot of the time, like, they'll just leave them and then the babies go on adventures, but there's plenty of scenes with the parents interacting with their children. And then there's one part of the Rugrats theory where they're like, everyone just pretends that Chucky is still alive, to make Chaz feel better, and that Chaz is nervous because of Chucky's death. And, like, none of this shit makes any fucking sense. They just pull shit out their ass, and it drives me up the fucking wall. A lot of those theory videos that I saw just clearly hadn't even watched the show. Like, when they tried to say that Rocco's neighbor in Rocco's Modern Life was a pedophile because she tried to seduce him. You know Rocco's an adult, right? Like, none of this shit makes any sense. Like, people who make cartoon theories are some of the dumbest fucking people online. So yeah, theories are fun. I like theorizing. There's some things that are clearly meant for you to try and theorize and figure out. Like I said, Yick is one of those things where part of the point of the game is to try and figure out what's actually going on. And you know, there's things like Serial Experiments Lane that are of a similar thing where you're trying to figure out the actual plot of what's actually happening. There's a lot of fun avant-garde stuff out there, and there's a lot of fun theories you can make about things. Like I said, I have plenty of my own theories that I come up with or that I accept. But that doesn't mean that theories in and of themselves are good. In fact, I'd say that overwhelmingly theories are bad. That said, I don't think that they're wholesale bad either, and there's plenty of fun theories. So it is kind of a mixed bag. But the point is, you gotta wade through a lot of shit before you get to the good stuff. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a few things, primarily different types of protagonists, antagonists, and other characters in storytelling in regards to morality, idealism, realism, sympathy, Things like that. There's a couple of different schools of thought on how a protagonist and an antagonist should be written, right? For instance, obviously I do like idealized characters, right? Heroes that are something to be aspired to. I think that that does absolutely serve its purpose, and I think we actually need more of that, because in today's day and age, we're too focused on everything being gray areas and having no real villains and stuff like that. And I think that that does go a bridge too far a lot, and there is a place for it. I absolutely think there is. In fact, I think we need both to an extent, because I think part of the problem, another way, on the opposite side, is if you make a character that's too perfect, that can do no wrong, that has no humanizing aspects of them, because it's our flaws that humanize us, right? Like, our flaws make us human, and I think that having a flawed protagonist works really well. And I think, a lot of the times in art, it can be written to have it so that you sympathize with everyone to a degree, or it can be written so there's very clear good guys and bad guys. And again, I think there's a place for both of them. I think they're both very important to art. I know Ayn Rand, Steve Ditko, objectivists typically like to have the idealized version where there's the very clear black and white, this is the hero, this is the villain, this is good, this is bad. And I do love that. There's things like The Shadow, Mr. A, The Question, stuff like that. I do really like that style of storytelling. Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, these things are good. But at the same time, they're not subtle, and in a way, they're done more for the ideology than rather just being a story that makes you think. They can make you think. I mean, I do like objectivist literature. I think it's really good. I do have some objectivist values. I'm not a full-on objectivist, but in some ways I am, like I said. Which is funny, because the concept of that almost goes against the principle of objectivism, about not compromising and stuff like that, but that's beside the point. So I will be giving some examples today, right? Because I think that, The Fountainhead is an excellent example of the idealized protagonist and antagonist done right? Howard Rourke is very clearly the good guy. He's on top. He's this wunderkind. He's young. He's on top of things. He has his shit all together at such a young age. And, all of the villains are very villainous. They're like, they gotta keep him down and stuff like that. And that is very good at teaching the moral of the story. You get that in Atlas Shrugged as well. Obviously that is the point with objectivist writing. And it's not to say that there isn't a way to write an objectivist character that is flawed, because look at early Spider-Man. Steve Ditko's input on Spider-Man, he did start out flawed, but that's because he was young. Ditko intended to make him into this objectivist hero by starting out young and then learning more as he went on. Obviously, once Ditko and Lee parted ways, Spider-Man went in a different direction. Spider-Man's still good after that in aspects, like Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. There's different eras of Spider-Man with varying degrees of quality, but I do tend to prefer that Ditko version. Something that I think is interesting that you could think of in a way, having flawed protagonists and even antagonists that are sympathetic can actually be a way to be idealistic in a different way, showing that no one is beyond redemption or that everyone is human. Something that I really love about the show Succession, which I've been watching lately, is, I got 5 episodes left, by the way, so I haven't quite finished it, but I'm close. But something that I really like about it is Succession is a show about these rich, self-centered assholes who all do pretty terrible things, but it never dehumanizes them. They're always portrayed in a sympathetic light. And I love that, because a lesser show would just make them the clear bad guys, right? Like, it would just make them out to be these evil, villainous, sociopaths. And I will do a full review of Succession when I finish it. But another thing is Shiv Roy, the only female child of the Roy family in Succession, is also portrayed just as evil and unlikable as the others, which I think is great, because a lesser show would be like, oh, okay, let's make the girl one the good one. Let's have the one good one. There is no one good one per se. Actually, you know what? I'd argue Connor is probably the one good one, and even then, he's also deeply flawed and insecure. But I would argue he's the most mature of the Roy children. But I think that also comes with the fact that he's also the most distant from the family. Which in and of itself is also really sad, because, family, I think, is very important. I think family is one of the most important things, and that's another theme of the show, is the way that their family is very, broken and fucked up and sad, and that's one thing I love about it. And I think that really works in humanizing them and making them sympathetic characters. Again, we'll go into more depth on Succession when I actually do my review of it. But another example of a deeply, deeply flawed protagonist that you sympathize with, Alex DeLarge from Clockwork Orange, right? He's pretty fucked up. But part of the fact is he's young, right? He's just a teenager, and he does a lot of horrible things. But then he goes through hell, and that makes us sympathize with him, and it humanizes him a bit, because we're seeing it all from his perspective. We also sympathize with characters like Walter White and Saul Goodman. And in the case of Saul Goodman, for instance, Chuck McGill, and mild spoilers here, is the good, morally upright one. But, you know, in Season 3, for instance, they make us dislike Chuck McGill quite a bit because he's morally upstanding. But it also comes down to, I think, the fact that Chuck McGill is disloyal to his brother and can't view him as a person. And also, Chuck McGill is an ungrateful piece of shit. Jimmy does so fucking much for him, and Chuck is such an ungrateful asshole about it. For instance, again, spoiler, but there's that line where Chuck says to Jimmy, "In all honesty, you've never mattered all that much to me." That's fucking heartbreaking, right? That moment you realize, no, fuck this guy. Another really good example is Tony Montana. Look at Tony Montana. He starts out as this really rough, Machiavellian fucking drug kingpin rising to the top, right? But then it gets to a point where they have to kill innocent children, kill a mother and her children, and Tony's like, no. Nobody said nothing about no kids. I'm not doing that. And then he completely turns on the people who were working with him on moral grounds and goes out. Like, Tony Montana could have possibly succeeded, rather than turning all of the other criminal organizations against him and having to go down in a blaze of glory. But he did the right thing. And that's another thing, is, in a story, does a character have to win? This is something that I've argued with some people online before about. I think a story where the good guys lose can be just as effective as a story where the good guys win. For instance, look at Bardock, the father of Goku. There's no real clear-cut good guy, other than Bardock is less evil than Frieza just by comparison. But Bardock is a genocidal, evil fucking tyrant who's helping an even more genocidal, evil tyrant. But Bardock cares about his people and his family, and so he goes out knowing that he has no chance of winning and confronts Frieza in a battle he knows he has absolutely no shred of even coming close to winning. I think a story where a character does the right thing, even if the consequences are death and there's no chance of success, can be inspiring. It's like, do the right thing just for doing the right thing. I mean, that also goes with, like, Rorschach, for instance. That's the whole point of Rorschach. I know Alan Moore wrote it in a negative light to try and make you think that Rorschach was foolish. But there's a reason Rorschach's the most popular character, because, again, Alan Moore unintentionally created a masterpiece in spite of himself, built on the foundation that Ditko and others put out there. I am a big fan of tragedy, as I've mentioned before, because I think tragedy can be effective, and it's also more realistic and more true to life. Now, that said, do I think every story should be a massive downer? Absolutely not. I think stories where the good guys win and show them prevailing against evil is good as well. But I think we need both. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is we need both the idealized story, and also we need the cynical story. We also need the realistic story. We need the tragedy, and we need the victory. We need both to make good art. You can't just have, one or the other. I think both are good. Obviously individual pieces can have one or the other. What I'm saying is, though, art as a medium needs it, right? We need stories that have both, because you need to be able to think about these perspectives and think about the morality of the choices that you would make in the situations, the morality of the choices behind the characters. Also, we do need bad art, too. That is true. You need something to compare to what's actually good. As much as I don't like bad art, it does need to exist. But another example, I would say, is we also need both sympathetic villains and evil villains, right? I think that there is a good place for both types of villains. Villains that are just ridiculously over-the-top evil have their place, especially in very black and white stories that are helping you learn morals. But if you want something that's going to make you think and question things, you also should have villains that are sympathetic and make you feel for them. And in some cases, even make you feel like they're almost justified. I think that also adds to it and makes interesting, thought-provoking material. But again, I do think there is a bit of an obsession with that in today's day and age, to the point where that has become a bit oversaturated. We do need some more of the objectivist look at it. But that said, a show like Succession, like I said, is super refreshing to see. A show that doesn't demonize these rich people, a show that actually keeps them human, even though they're fucked up. Again, I'll do a full review of that once I watch the last 5 episodes, but there's a lot of things that have been turning in my head, making me think about this, being like, there's a place for the protagonist that's likable, and there's even a place for the protagonist that's unlikable. For instance, look at Alex and Yick. I know a lot of people are fucking stupid about that and think that it's badly written because they don't understand it. But when you actually understand the narrative of the character being an unreliable narrator, it actually serves its purpose. If Alex was a likable person, it would be a very different game. If Alex actually changed from his mistakes, the game wouldn't be the same thing, right? Alex's inability to change and his need to twist the story and the narrative to make you think that he's better than he actually is part of what makes it brilliant. Like I said, I've completely accepted that Yick is actually good art, and people who don't think that just don't get it. And I know that sounds pretentious as hell, but I don't care, because frankly I like that it gatekeeps itself and keeps people from actually liking it, because I like niche fan bases. I don't like it when normies get too involved and it becomes, you know, oversaturated. Hell, I think there can be stories that have characters that are intentionally written to be unlikable, evil pieces of shit that fans ironically end up liking and actually, you know, rooting for. Like, for instance, Boogie. Boogie the Oily is very similar to Rorschach in what he was set out to represent, although he's much more extreme, because Boogie, they made just like this fucking evil, sadistic piece of shit. Boogie's like the ultimate objectivist as far as, like, Boogie is an objectivist written by someone who hates objectivism. Like, that's the whole point behind the character. But he's a very good character, and again, it's another one that gatekeeps itself, partially because, you know, it's kind of obscure, it's only released in Argentina, it's never been translated into English. I'm talking about the comics, of course. The movie did come out here. Hell, when you look at Satan and Devilman, he's written so well as a sympathetic villain, there's a bunch of the fan base that is retarded and thinks that he's actually a good guy or the hero. When no, he's just a sympathetic villain with actual, like, reasonable motivations. Like, not reasonable action, but his motivations are understandable. But that's all I really have to say today, I think. I think you get the point I'm trying to make. I think both forms of art, both idealistic and realistic, cynical, having a moral, is all important for art. Now, I don't necessarily think art has to have a moral either. That's another thing. Art can just exist for the sake of making something that's an expression of something, right? Like, for instance, to make you laugh. Stuff like that, right? But again, we've kind of gone all over the place today, so I think you get my point. Today we'll be talking about fighting games. Now, fighting games have a pretty wide spectrum of what is included. You know, there's tournament fighters, there's things like Super Smash Bros., there's things like Mortal Kombat, there's Street Fighter, Dead or Alive, Virtua Fighter. There's a lot, right? There's a lot of different fighting games, and a lot of different kinds of fighting games. You know, 3D aesthetic, 2D aesthetic, 3D or 2D space as far as, like, movement. There's some that are sort of like beat-em-up fighter hybrids. There's a bunch of different types. There's also subgenres, things like wrestling games I think you could kind of lump in, but are also kind of their own thing. The only one I really grew up with as an actual fighting game was Mortal Kombat, my introduction being Mortal Kombat 4, and I did a whole nostalgic gaming stories on Mortal Kombat 4. But Mortal Kombat is the only fighting game series that I really got super into. There were a couple of others that I played a decent amount of. For instance, I did play quite a lot of Dead or Alive 1 and 2, and a decent amount of Dead or Alive 3. But I didn't really play anything later than that. I have played a little bit of Street Fighter here and there, but I've never been the biggest Street Fighter guy. And I'm played, you know, a decent amount of Super Smash Bros. Here and there, but again, it's not really my favorite. Mortal Kombat is my favorite fighting game series, just because I like the gore, I like the characters. I think Scorpion's a way cooler character than any other fighting game character. I think the combos are just the right amount of complexity. They're not too crazy to pull off, but they still require a decent amount of inputs depending on what, like, special moves you're pulling off, what combos you're doing, things like that. My favorite Mortal Kombat game is Mortal Kombat Deception, with a close second being Armageddon, followed by Shaolin Monks, and then Mortal Kombat 9, Mortal Kombat 4, and so on. Now, with the Mortal Kombat games, I think the last truly great Mortal Kombat game was Mortal Kombat 9, which is the one that was just called Mortal Kombat when they rebooted it. Mortal Kombat X, I was pretty disappointed in. There was a couple of characters that I liked. I played a decent amount of it. I beat the whole story mode. But overall, I didn't like most of the new characters, and I hated what they did with some of the old characters, and I just didn't really feel it, you know? And then 11 came out, and there was just a bunch of dumb shit in that game. Like, Jax's ending was absolutely atrocious. There were all these little quips of dialogue that I heard that I hated, and I just didn't overall like it. It just felt like X, but, like, worse. Gameplay-wise, it was fine, but it didn't really do anything that X didn't already do, and X itself was already built kind of on the framework of Mortal Kombat 9. Not to say that they need to always mix it up, and there are little differences between each of them, to be fair, but I never really got into it. I played a little bit of 11 at a coworker's house one time, and, you know, again, gameplay-wise it was fine, but I hated the story, and, like, Mortal Kombat isn't one you think of being very story-heavy, but I actually do care about the story and characters, even if there are a lot of inconsistencies in characters who have died multiple times canonically because the canon is kind of a mess. Not to mention the other timeline starting with Mortal Kombat 9. And then there's yet another timeline starting with the new game, Mortal Kombat 1, and then there's Mortal Kombat 2. Again, not to be confused with the original Mortal Kombat 1 and 2. I think the naming conventions are fucking retarded now. And a bunch of the new changes are just, like, changes for the sake of changing it, like making Bihan into Scorpion. So literally turning Sub-Zero into Scorpion. How stupid is that? But I've already talked about how Mortal Kombat fell off and stuff in my other videos. But yeah, Mortal Kombat, it's my favorite fighting series. But I did play a good amount of Dead or Alive 1 and 2, because I got the Xbox set Dead or Alive 1 and 2 Ultimate. Now, Dead or Alive 2 was the one I preferred out of the two, and the character that I always played as was Bass. Now, a lot of people love to go in and play as the chicks in the skimpy outfits, and yeah, there's obviously an appeal to that, but I always just liked playing as Bass because he was like Fat Hulk Hogan, like he's an old retired wrestler, and he moves slow, but he hits like a fucking truck. He deals so much damage that he's just so cheap to use, and I fucking love it. Now, obviously, any competent player can easily counter it, but I played Dead or Alive recently when Theron came over on Thursday, and I played as Bass, and I just fucking destroyed him. It was really funny. To be fair, we had played Battlefront 2, the original, and he kept spamming Force Push at me, so I got mad, and then I played that, and I also kicked his ass at Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, because I knew Shaolin Monks was the one he wouldn't know how to play, because it plays differently than the others, and it's one of my favorites, so obviously I know how to play it. But I also played a good amount of wrestling games back in the day, the SmackDown vs. Raw series being my favorite, especially the original SmackDown vs. Raw. I've only recently played 2006, I've heard that one's the best one, but I haven't played a ton of it. But I did play a good amount of SmackDown, SmackDown 2 Know Your Role, SmackDown Just Bring It. I played a little bit of Here Comes the Pain. I also played Raw 2. I never played Raw 1, and then I played some of the 64 ones, you know, WrestleMania 2000, ECW Hardcore, WCW vs. NWO, and then I also played WCW Backstage Assault on the PS1 at one point. I played a lot of wrestling games. You know what wrestling game is probably like the most underrated wrestling game? TNA Impact on the 360. That game is fucking great. It literally created a wrestler just for the game that they later put into actual matches, which I thought was pretty cool. Yeah, I never really got into Street Fighter all that much. When I did play it, I would typically play as either M. Bison, Blanca, or Guile. I played as Vega a little bit too. I thought he was kind of cool. But I didn't play a ton of Street Fighter. I did play a little bit. I played through Smash Brothers Brawl's Slipspace Emissary, the story mode, and that was fun enough. But again, I'm not the biggest fan of just the percentage thing. I much prefer just health bars. I guess I like simplicity in my fighting games to an extent. And obviously, since I'm a fan of Mortal Kombat, I like the gore, which is definitely a factor that carried it over a lot of the other franchises of the time. Certainly not competitive when it comes to fighting games because I'm not very good at them. But I do enjoy playing them, especially when they have a story mode. Mortal Kombat's Conquest mode was always a favorite of mine, hence why Deception is my favorite. Armageddon also has a great Conquest mode, and Shaolin Monks is literally a story-based Mortal Kombat sort of beat-em-up fighting game hybrid, which is why, again, that one's pretty high up for me as well. Something about modern fighting games that you don't see as much as you did in older fighting games is you don't see unlockables as much, which really pisses me off, because unlockables was always a cool thing to have. Like, you progress through the game, you unlock new characters, you unlock new costumes, you unlock new arenas, you unlock new moves and fatalities and things. But nowadays, everything's just DLC, or it's all unlocked at the start. And having it all unlocked at the start, I can kind of understand, but I don't like, because I like the idea of progression. For instance, when I bought Mortal Kombat Complete Edition, which was the all DLC included Mortal Kombat 9, it had all the characters unlocked from the start. Now, I had previously rented the game from, it was either Gamefly or Blockbuster, I can't remember, it was so long ago. Probably Gamefly. Point is, we rented Mortal Kombat 9, and I had unlocked some stuff. And so that was cool. But then when we returned it, I eventually bought it, but I bought the Complete Edition because I wanted all the stuff. It was all unlocked at the start, which I was like, oh, that's kind of lame. So I don't have to unlock all this shit, so when I unlocked it on my main profile, there was no point to that. That's the problem I have with the current model of fighting games. Mortal Kombat lately just seems to be interested in just DLC. They care more about releasing a bunch of guest characters than actually focusing on making the next game, or making alternative modes. Like, why don't we get things like Conquest, or Puzzle Combat, or Chess Combat, or Kart Combat? Why don't we get all of this stuff anymore? It used to be really cool to have all this different shit and variety in these games. But now it's just fighting game, 2.5D, with a story that's very simplistic, which, you know, I could deal with all that if it wasn't all just the same shit and they hadn't fucking, like, ruined a lot of the staples of the franchise for me. But yeah, I enjoy fighting games. I think it's a fun genre, but I am kind of particular with it, and I'm certainly not competitive with it. So recently I've done a few streams of Oblivion Remastered, and it's a perfectly serviceable way to play Oblivion, although I've got my own gripes with it, which we'll talk about a little here, because this will also be kind of a review of that. But more broadly, I wanted to discuss game remakes, remasters, re-releases, and things like that. Obviously, we're in an age where there's a lot of game remakes like that. There's ones that are just straight-up remasters, where it's just the graphics done over the original gameplay as like a new shell. For instance, things like Halo, the Master Chief Collection, has, Halo 1 and 2 like that, and then Halo 1 also had Anniversary on the 360 prior to that, which, was later tweaked for MCC. With those, I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it. I love MCC. It's a really convenient way to play most of the Halo games. In fact, all the ones that I really care to play. With Halo 1 Anniversary, I do have some gripes, like the fact that it just reuses a bunch of Reach graphics for the most part. And, it is a little bit janky in a few areas. Halo 2 Anniversary, I think, looks a hell of a lot better. Halo 1 Anniversary also completely ruins the atmosphere of 343 Guilty Spark, which is one problem I see a lot with remasters, is when there's, like, horror-themed areas and stuff in non-horror games. A lot of the time, the atmosphere just feels kind of ruined. For instance, I remember being really disappointed in Oblivion Remastered when I got to the Lighthouse in the Dark Brotherhood questline, because that's like one of the most iconic parts of the game to me. It just seemed less gory, less atmospheric, it was more well lit by like a lot, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there like a creepy sound effect, like a low-pitched hum in the original version that just didn't seem to be there in the remake? Maybe I'm wrong on that last detail, but I seem to recall that. Regardless, it's much more well lit, and the gore is much more subtle, and honestly, like the flayed Lucy and LeChance as well, while it's technically more graphically sound, just seems less brutal in the remake than it did in the original. But, in addition to remakes, in addition to remasters, there's also remakes, because the Oblivion one is kind of this weird in-between where they tweaked the leveling system, they added in sprinting, and tweaked a couple other gameplay mechanics, but largely the gameplay is left unchanged. But there's games like, Conquer, Live, and Reloaded, which, by the way, underrated as hell game. I've got my own gripes with it, obviously. Like, I do prefer Bad Fur Day. But Live and Reloaded is still a perfectly cromulent way to play the game. And I think it's worth playing even if you have played Bad Fur Day, because they're different enough to both deserve to exist. That said, like I said, aesthetically, there are a lot of things I don't like. However, the last third of the game, spooky, war, and heist, all are just better in Live and Reloaded. Then, of course, there's things like the Insane trilogy from Crash Bandicoot, which I haven't played, so I'm not really going to comment on. But there's also the Spyro Reignited trilogy, which again is fine, and there are some things that are better in it. However, I do have my problems with the aesthetic, because one of the problems I see with a lot of, either newer entries in older franchises like that, particularly with platformers, or with remakes of them, they make everything really, sharp-edged and angular, instead of having anything be round, and that's one of the problems I have with Spyro Reignited. Again, it's a fine game, but there are some aesthetic problems I have with it, and, there is some jank to it that wasn't in the original, and they did remove some of the jank from the original, for both better and worse, because some of it was fun. Hitboxes, gliding, things like that aren't as consistent in the Reignited trilogy as they were in the original. Again, it is a good re-release, it is a good remaster to an extent, but I do have my problems with it, although I should probably get back to streaming it at some point. And of course, there's really, really half-assed remasters where they basically just upscale the game, slap it on a disc, and put it on the next generation of consoles. There's a lot of these that I actually do like that a lot of people have problems with. For instance, Silent Hill 2 HD on the 360. I know that it is inferior with, the fog, and, some of the stuff doesn't look quite right, and things like that. Having never played the original, I still found that to be a pretty serviceable way to play the game. I still had a lot of fun playing it. It was my first time playing through Silent Hill 2. So, taking that into account, knowing that, there are many aspects that make it inferior to the original, nevertheless, it was still a perfectly fine way for me to play the game. I quite enjoyed it. Or then there's things like Dragon Ball Z Budokai HD Collection, which I know that, they replaced all the music because there was, some issues with, plagiarism or something with the original soundtrack. Nevertheless, the soundtrack they used a lot of music from Tenkaichi 2. which had a really kick-ass soundtrack, so it still has a really good soundtrack. Well, there was the Call of Duty port on 360 that only ported the campaign for Call of Duty 1 that was called Call of Duty Classic. That was my first way to play through Call of Duty 1 as well. So I guess what I'm saying is it does range in scale in how good these remakes, remasters, and re-releases are. I do think that they have a purpose, but I do think we have an over-reliance on them. For instance, when they say, oh, there's rumors of a Fallout 3 remake, I don't want that. I do have my own problems with the Oblivion remake. For instance, aesthetically, I don't like the way a lot of the characters' faces look. Like, I know that the faces in Oblivion were, like, kind of derpy, but that was iconic about it. There's a lot less color in the remake, so a lot of things don't seem as, like, whimsical to me. Like, there are things that still work, and there's a lot of good lighting in the remake. But the problem I have is that, again, it just doesn't look quite as magical. It's not as iconic. Because I think one of the problems we have in today's day and age is everything's focused on hyper-realism, as opposed to, having things be aesthetically pleasing. I think we've reached a point where, like, for instance, I think the perfect aesthetic for, like, an RPG is, Oblivion Original, Fallout 3, and Fallout New Vegas. Those all look great. And then, you had Skyrim, which I think, worked for Skyrim, but then they had that kind of similar aesthetic in Fallout 4, and I hated it. So that's one of my things I worry about with the potential of a Fallout 3 remake, is that it'll make everything look like Fallout 4. And I really hope they wouldn't tweak the level system to be anything like Fallout 4, because I really fucking hate the Fallout 4 level system. But yeah, I really hope that they don't make Fallout 3 anything like Fallout 4 if they do a remake. I really don't see any purpose of a remake. Like, the ones I would want remade would be things like Daggerfall or Fallout 1 and 2. Like, all the ones that are already good, I don't want to remake, but the ones that I like in concept but don't really like the gameplay of, those are the ones I'd want to see a remake of. One of my problems that I have with the aesthetic, though, like I said, is the character designs. They're all really, like, hyper-realistic, but they're, like, fucking gelatinous. Like, it seems almost too real to be real. Like, there's a reason the term hyper-realism exists. But, like, it looks like they're, like, have, like, a fucking fake skin over them. Like, it doesn't seem real. Seems kind of uncanny and weird to me. And it seems almost AI-like. I know I've brought this up before, but there's just a lot of things I hate about the aesthetic. Also, side note, there was the fucking fact that they replaced male and female with Type 1 and Type 2, and then people fucking chimped out about Nexus mods having a mod to change that back. So it's like a whole big thing. It's a fucking problem with games in general now. But there is a lot of little issues and things that I have with it. Again, it's a perfectly fine way to play Oblivion. There are some things that are cool about it. But all these people acting like it's superior to the original are fucking crazy to me. So, game remakes have their place, but largely I think we're over-dependent on them, and a lot of the times there can be problems.
You take forever to say nothing.
Subscribe to Fugitive Red Eye.